Councilmember Danuski.
Here.
If you all stand and join my wife Sherry Baker in the flag salute. This is more or less for the council's benefit. As you know that I'm adopted, and I first found my family just about 2 years ago this month. And my aunt and uncle from Indiana, my newfound family, is sitting there in the audience, Janet and Phil Alt, and so I just wanted to take this time to introduce them. All right, next item on the agenda is approval of the agenda. If there are no objections, the agenda will stand approved as written. We might need to make a quick change on the fly in that the two people that are supposed to be here and speak in the first item on the business agenda are not here yet. One's coming from Olympia, the other's coming from Renton. So we may shift things a little bit. So if there are no objections to that, then we will, again, approve the agenda. Well, we have one here. Wonderful. Councilmember Rod Dembowski has just joined us. All right. First item on the agenda there is the introduction of Thomas Joachimides from Bryan, Hampson, our development director.
Hey, good evening, Council and Mayor. Yeah, I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce you to our new development review engineer. This is Thomas Joachimides. He's from a local firm, so this is his first time he's coming over into the public side, where he's been over there for about 5 years, and before that he was in Hawaii working for another engineering firm. So we're really excited to have him. He comes highly recommended and qualified, and we're really looking forward to working with him.
And he's a Kenmore resident.
Yay!
Did you want to say anything?
No, I just wanted to say thanks for having me. I'm really excited to start new chapter in my life. And I do live in Kenmore, right nearby. I've got wife, 3 kids, dog, cat, 9 yards. So I'm just excited to get going and learning what I can do to help the city.
Well, welcome.
Thanks.
We're very excited to have you. I think you're going to find that we've got a great staff. I know that the council thinks the world of our staff. Got a bunch of talented people who will talk for the city, and so welcome to the group.
Thank you.
All right, thanks.
All right, next item on the agenda is citizen comments. This is an opportunity for you to express your views on issues that are important to you and to the community. And if you will please limit your comments to 3 minutes. We have a timer on the screen behind me to sort of help you. Will the clerk please call the first person?
Nadia Silver.
My name is Nadia Reyna Silver. I live at 18230 70th Lane Northeast in Kenmore, Washington. I am here because I wanted to thank you guys for the work you've been doing for the past 2 years of my residency as of October 1st. And I just wanted to let you guys know that you're doing a great job. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I did want to say to the city manager, I have a question, moreover, because it was last year we had hooligans, that's all I can say, destroy a beautiful bamboo bush, and they're at it again. I was told by what I'm assuming is their parental unit that the landscapers told them it was okay to tear apart that bush. As far as I understand, that stretch of land between North Shore Townhomes and my location is property of the city, therefore under city manager jurisdiction, so I'm also looking to be corrected if that is incorrect as well. Because I really do enjoy the foliage along that walk, and a lot of other dog walkers and dog parents enjoy it as well. So if we can get some clarification on that, that'd be great. Or if there's some kind of way that if that is under city jurisdiction, we can figure out how to manage it with less hooliganery, that'd be great. Other thanks so much for all your work.
Thank you very much, Ms. Silver.
Mayor, there's nobody else signed up.
Anybody else wishing to speak and be heard? Anybody else wishing to speak and be heard? Thank you, Ms. Silver, for your comments. I'm sure the city manager has taken note, and Joe will get it to the proper people, but thank you very much. So the next item on the agenda is discussion of the proposed King County Regional Homeless Authority, but, oh, yes, that's right. Got ahead of myself. Next item on the agenda is the consent agenda. Is there a motion to approve?
So moved.
Second.
Moved and seconded. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Consent agenda stands approved unanimously. Okay, now, one of the people that is going to be presenting is on their way up from Olympia, Leo Floor. He is the director of the King County Department of Community and Human Services. He's not here yet. So, Councilmember Dembowski, should we wait for him? Yeah, let's go ahead and wait. All right, let's go to the second item. Ms. Gregory, first reading of the bond ordinance 19-0499.
Good evening, Mayor Baker and Council. It's a very exciting step we're taking tonight because, as you can recall, the city's Walkways and Waterways Proposition 1, a $19,750,000 bond measure, was approved by our voters in 2016 for the purpose of funding certain capital projects. And then in December of that year, the city issued $9,220,000 of the authorized amount, and with that revenue began work on those 5 walkways and waterways projects. So 3 years have passed, and now the city desires to issue the remaining authorized bonds in order to provide financing that's needed to advance those projects into construction and completion. In order to do so, the first step the City Council must take is adopt an ordinance which authorizes issuing those general obligation bonds, and that is the ordinance that's included in your council packet with the agenda bill. So tonight we're joined by Deanna Gregory of Pacifica Law Group. She serves as our city's bond counsel, and Justin Monway of Piper Jaffray, who serves as the city's financial advisor. Ms. Gregory will present a summary of the bond ordinance, and I recognize that there are some new members on the council who were not on the council when we went through the first bond ordinance approval process, so this will be a little new experience for you. So she'll talk you through that process, and then Mr. Monway will review the preliminary schedule of events that will take place between now and the closing of the sale of the bonds, which we are projecting to take place in December, and he can provide some information on how tax rates have changed over this period of time and what the debt service may be. So I will turn it over to Deanna Gregory to first walk you through the bond ordinance. This is the first reading, and we expect to bring that back on November 12th for final adoption.
Thank you. Mayor, members of the council, I'm Deanna Gregory. No relation, but we always do get that question. I'm a partner of Pacifica Law Group, and we serve as bond counsel to the city, and I have a lot of feedback right now. There we go. I think that's better. As Joanne said, in front of you tonight is a draft ordinance that is the ordinance that authorizes the issuance of not to exceed $10 million of bonds. This is the second and final tranche, if you will, of bonds that were authorized by the voters as part of the walkways and waterways ballot proposition. And with this bond ordinance and with this bond issue, if you do approve this bond issuance and the bonds are priced to move forward as scheduled, this will be the final and last bond issue under that voter approval. As Joanne mentioned, this is the first reading of the ordinance, and it will come back to you for second and final reading and consideration on November 12th. At that time, that will be the only council action that is necessary for the approval of these bonds. This ordinance contains all of the approval that's necessary pursuant to state law for these bonds to be issued, now that we have, of course, voter approval. For all intents and purposes, it's very similar to the one that was approved not too long ago for the first tranche of bonds. And it's similar to that ordinance, does delegate the authority to approve the final terms of the bonds to certain designated representatives. You may have seen that language in the document. There is a not to exceed principal amount of $10 million, meaning that the bonds themselves cannot exceed a principal or a par or a face amount of $10 million. And there are a number of other provisions, and if you are looking at the ordinance, you can see in section 12 that there's a not to exceed true interest costs for the bonds, as well as a not to exceed final maturity date for the bonds. So long as the final terms fall within those parameters approved by the council, then the authorized representatives in this document can approve the final terms. You will then get a report back on what those final interest rates and what the terms are, but no additional council action will be necessary. And that's allowed under state law for a variety of reasons. Allows really your finance team, so your financial advisor and as well as the underwriting team, to really time the market and to really look at what the market is doing, look at the ups and downs, and really find that nice sweet spot, and using, of course, their magic, globes, to really price those bonds and nail down those interest rates on a day that really works for the city and the parties involved. And allows us to be able to move forward without needing to call a special meeting or take any additional action. So it allows for some quick movement on that day. Like I said, this is the last and the only action that's required by the council. And so long as those parameters can be met, that's the big footnote there. If there's some reason why the market has changed or if circumstances have changed and those parameters cannot be met, then we will have to come back to council for additional approval and the bonds will not be sold. Let's see here. I think that's about kind of the sum of the authorization in this ordinance. The bonds are expected to be issued on a tax-exempt basis, given the good governmental purposes of the bonds to be issued. And even though it does say one or more series, we do anticipate one series of bonds. So I'd be happy to answer any questions about the ordinance itself. After consideration and approval on November 12th, there'll be a number of steps that we will take on the city's behalf in terms of preparing various closing documents and working with the finance team to finalize the disclosure related to the bonds and then bring it to bond issue to a closing, and that's the date when the city receives the money for the projects. And Justin will talk about the schedule during his presentation. So I'd be happy to answer any questions on the ordinance, or we can wait until we're done.
Any questions? Okay,
Great, thank you.
Good evening.
press the button. There you go.
Hello? Okay.
That's your turn to heads.
Okay, good evening, Mr. Mayor and members of the council. My name is Justin Monway with Piper Jaffray. We're the city's financial advisor. And did you receive this packet that I brought? Okay. So just want to start off by saying this is a great time to borrow. We're at near historic lows for interest rates right now. So if you look at page 1, that is the general obligation bond buyer index interest rate history. Bond buyer index is basically the average of 40 recent bond issues, the average interest rate of 40 recent bond issues with a rating of A or higher. And the city of Kenmore is rated AAA. So AAA is the highest possible rating, and the next level down is AA, then you got your single A category. And just to show you a couple markers here, back in early December of 2016, the rate was at 3.78%. That's when you last borrowed for the 2016 bonds. And today we're at 2.7%. So over a percentage lower than where we were back then. And if you look at page 2, back when you issued the 2016 bonds, you had told voters that you expect that the levy rate would be at about 32 cents and no higher, and that's where we were at when we issued the bonds. And since then, interest rates have gone down and assessed values have gone up. So, for instance, in 2019, this year, your levy rate was down to 25 cents per thousand, and that's because your interest rates have increased quite a bit. The debt stayed the same, but the assessed value has gone up, so the levy rate, tax rate has gone down. And with current market conditions, we're expecting that in 2020, your levy rate should be at about 22 cents per thousand, so about 10 cents per $1,000 less than where you were in 2016. And then on page 3, that's just the schedule of events. That just shows some key dates would include, in the first week of November, we plan to talk to the rating agencies along with Joanne and Rob, and just to hopefully maintain that AAA rating. Sale date, well, as Deanna mentioned, on November 12th, that's when the council will hopefully approve the bond ordinance. And bond sale date, November 21st, and then December 10th is when we will close the bonds, and that's when the city will receive its $10 million in proceeds in order to fund the rest of the projects. So, are there any questions?
Any questions? Yes, Councilmember Smith and Councilmember Curtis.
I just have one question on this. Because of the decrease in interest rates, so it looks like it's about 100,000 less in debt service from the prior issuance?
Yeah, so when the city issued the bonds in 2016, what we did was we also used rates at that time and added 100 basis points of cushion to the 2019 bonds, the projected 2019 bonds, because we like to be conservative with our estimates. And so when we structured it, we saw that, okay, the total debt service in each year with the two issues combined would be at about 1.2 million. But with the lower interest rates, we're projecting out about 1.1 million after these bonds are issued.
Great, thanks.
Councilmember Curtis.
So our bond rating, is this second time as vigorous as the first time, or is it like just a brush up?
I'd say it's just a brush up, just to make sure that, because the rating in 2016 was the first time the city sought a rating. And so there was a lot of work involved with that. Now it's just pretty much updating what's been new that's happened since 2016. And pretty much everything is just, I mean, the city's expanded quite a bit, and financials still look great. So
we're expecting a AAA rating again?
I should hope so. I mean, I don't see any reason why there should be any change in that.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you. Thank you very much. All right, looks like all the people are here. So we're back to the first item on the agenda, and that is going to be on the Regional Homelessness Authority. And Leo Flor, the Director of Human Services, and let me get this right here. Department of Community and Human Services. Councilmember Rod Dembowski, and Mr. Flor, you are joined by somebody?
Yes, sir.
Yes, Mr. Mayor, I'm joined by Shannon Braddock from the Executive's Office, Director of Government Relations.
Do you want her at the table with you?
Have her join us, Mr. Mayor.
Great. So I understand you have a presentation for us?
Yes, sir.
Great.
So very quickly, I do apologize for not being here on the original call, and thank you for giving us an opportunity to talk about the Regional Homelessness Authority.
Is your mic on? Yeah, gotta push the button.
All right.
There you go.
Okay. So thank you very much. I will move through this quickly, and then unless it's your preference to do it otherwise, Mr. Mayor, I'm happy to take questions as we go. What we're here to talk about really quickly is the concept behind the proposed King County Regional Homelessness Authority. And the proposal is really set up to address two issues that we see in our system right now. And so that's what I'd like to spend a little bit of time on. Those are fragmentation in the system and inequity. Fragmentation in our current system is a well-studied problem. What we've depicted here, and I won't read all of the individual quotes, is we do have a steady stream of analysis, both from local experts, from national experts, from media, really all identifying consistently the same persistent issue in our current homelessness system, which is that it is too fragmented to continue to improve services and to continue to get better at the way that we deliver services for people experiencing homelessness. And so here, this really is a highlight of a structural fragmentation that we'll depict in another way. So this is a illustration by the King County Auditor's Office in May of last year, really finding or attempting to depict here 3 different funding sources and then a separate decision-making body that are all involved in our current structure. So that, by that I mean there's the Department of Housing and Urban Development at the federal level. There's a federally mandated continuum of care lead body called All Home. There's certainly King County, and then there are cities. We've depicted here the city of Seattle, which is the largest by amount funder for homelessness services, certainly within its own boundaries, but also within our system. But I think the other important aspect to recognize here, and that we do recognize, is that all cities are working with this issue, and some cities are providing direct services for funding. Some cities are also dealing with other aspects that result from the problem. But I think the point that we want to get across here is that in all of these cases, the way that our regional system is currently constructed is that at least 3 of those bodies, and in most cases 4 of those bodies, are all involved in any major policy consideration that has to do with how we will implement improvements or deliver services to people experiencing homelessness. What we've depicted here on the right-hand side is just sort of the different types of stakeholders that are really affected by the current situation. One that I would like to pay particular attention to is with contractors. It is true right now in our current system that we have contractors that have multiple contracts from multiple funders to provide the same services to the same people. And what we see as a result of that is that in all of those cases, those contractors are reporting on different metrics, on different schedules, receiving different payment points, and sometimes also on different schedules. And rather than taking these scarce resources and really being able to focus them on the provision of services, which is what I think we all intend for public funding that's going into services for persons experiencing homelessness, we do have a system where we spend a lot of time reporting to multiple people about the same programs, and there's an inefficiency there that we absolutely seek to correct with this proposal. Another one that I want to highlight, and it's the second from bottom here, is it's difficult for different parts of the county to really be able to influence the system. And one of the examples that we use is the Coordinated Entry for All system right now. So for folks who don't know, that's the system by which any person who seeks a placement in permanent supportive housing that's funded by the county, the city of Seattle, or the federal government, you have to go through the system. And nobody is satisfied with the way that it works. Everybody has identified ways that it could work better. And I don't think that any city right now could answer the question of to whom would you go in order to advocate for a particular change and then see that change affected. And the reason that that's confusing is that it's actually at least 3 of the entities that are on that auditor's diagram that you would have to go to that independently make decisions about this and then would have to fully align in order to implement a change. And so while we do make changes in coordinated entry, we make them slowly, and it's not the sort of nimble decision-making that we know both policymakers and members of the public expect of us to be able to make on a more quick basis. And so the structure that we propose is also intended to fully integrate all of these disparate decision-making structures. And then the last piece, and this is what this really gets to, is accountability. This is a system in which right now who do you go to on that picture in order to hold them accountable for results, in order to ensure accountability for continued progress? And the answer right now is you have to go to all of them. And that is not a structure that is necessary. It's a structure that is a result of previous shifts in our community to attempt to centralize some functions but not other functions. And so for folks who are familiar with the long track of this discussion, we had the Committee to End Homelessness, which eventually gave way to All Home. And in each of those cases, we aggregated a little bit more of the resources, authority, mandate, and decision-making power. And what we seek to do here is to complete that unification in this proposal so that the same body that has the responsibility, the same body that has the resources, the same body that has the mandate has the ability to implement changes but still retaining accountability to the overall system and to policymakers. The other issue besides fragmentation that we really want to highlight here is disparity. We have a system right now where it is a persistent, long-standing function that if you are a Black or African American member of our community, you are 5 times overrepresented amongst people experiencing homelessness. It's not a bug. It is a feature of our system, and it's long-standing and persistent. If you are a Native American member of our community, you are overrepresented by 10 times in our current system. It doesn't matter if it's point-in-time count or our homeless management information system, and it doesn't matter if you look at it now or you look at it 20 years ago. These are persistent features of the way we've structured the delivery and provision of homelessness services, and that's another thing that we really seek to attempt to do better on and to correct through this proposal. So those are really the 2 issues that we've identified to solve in this proposal, and one of the questions we get quite a bit is how would we define success in what we are proposing, and we would absolutely define success as unification of governance so we don't have this fractured decision-making and we have the ability to quickly identify and then to conclusively implement solutions that we know work. And then the second piece is to reduce inequity in our system that I don't think any of us finds tolerable and yet is something that we have collectively tolerated for a very long time. Process overview, and we'll speed up here to get to the pith of it. We are engaged in a system that is taking a broader look at what we do with homelessness system services and prevention of homelessness. What we are doing is what's highlighted here in the red rectangle. It's a very narrow part of that. It is how do we govern the crisis response system specifically. There's also an important conversation that's going on in parallel, which is that private funders also suffer from fragmentation, and they are also attempting to unify themselves into an external partners group. The idea here is we unify and align the efforts within government, do the same thing outside of government, and then those 2 major contributors to the same system can operate together in a way, again, where we're focusing on the same values, getting more effective programming. Just for a sense of scale, we're talking about $130 million a year between the City of Seattle and King County, including federal funds and homelessness services, and then in the private and philanthropic sector, about another $26 million a year. This is a slide, I won't read through all of these. Another of the questions that we get quite a bit is this feels sudden to some folks, and how have we been engaging over time, not just with the City of Seattle, but also with the entire region. It's a regional problem, requires a regional solution, it requires regional engagement. So I've just listed here, I won't read through those exhaustively, but it is to say that we've heard quite a bit from both individual cities, people from those cities when not representing the cities, and then from the Sound Cities Association itself, and have in several instances been able to make changes to the proposal prior to its transmittal that actually attempted to account for and incorporate that input. And one of the big examples there is a really explicit requirement in the proposed legislation around the requirement that we have for the first time sub-regional planning, so that there's the ability to plan in a different and tailored way for different regions of the county, and that it's required to exist in a way that it does not right now. What is the King County Regional Homelessness Authority? So I apologize, that's the acronym at the top, so we spent more time thinking about the contents of the legislation than a good acronym there. But it is a public development authority proposal chartered by the county. It is currently before both the King County Council, including a mandatory dual referral to the Regional Policy Committee, and also before the Seattle City Council. The scope we are talking about is coterminous with King County, which is why it was important that King County be the legal entity that could create or charter the PDA. What we're seeking to do in terms of levels of government is, again, federal, local, And by local, we mean both city and county, and aligning them vertically in a way that we don't have right now. And then the last piece is this is a unification of existing programs. One of the questions that we sometimes get is this a revenue generating mechanism? This Public Development Authority is incompetent to generate revenue. It will not. This is purely about existing programs. Nothing in this legislation or in the underlying statute to create a Public Development Authority allows it to generate its revenue, or its own revenue, excuse me. Another question that we get quite a bit is why a Public Development Authority? There are several forms that a legal entity like this could take. One of them is that this is the form that really strikes the sort of optimum balance between reducing fragmentation in a single entity that is sufficiently well connected to the government that it remains accountable to elected leadership, but also is a form that multiple cities could feel comfortable investing in, and knowing that not one jurisdiction would sort of overrule other jurisdictions. And so this really gets the right balance in our analysis between having the ability to tailor solutions that make sense for the entire region, but retaining accountability to parent organizations. Another question, or version of this question, is why create more government? Some PDAs, I think, if they were a separation of a single government function in the first place, could be interpreted as being more government. The way that we have proposed this is really to take functions operating at 3 or 4 governments at once and then bring them into one. And so we really do see this as both more efficient, more effective government, and it is consolidation of those functions, at least at King County, the City of Seattle, and all home, and actually bringing them just into one agency. Another thing in exploring alternatives to public development authorities, a lot of those alternatives are set up for specific purposes. And so the Board of Health is one example where the Board of Health is set up to exercise state legislated or state delegated powers, often contrary to what a particular jurisdiction or municipality might want to have happen. So Board of Health model allows that board and empowers that board to actually overrule particular jurisdictions, and that's a question that we get quite a bit. And nothing in this proposal and nothing in its intent is designed to overrule a particular municipality's ability to set its own policy. So just to be clear, this just like it's incompetent to generate revenue or to create taxes, the Public Development Authority is also incompetent to tell a jurisdiction what to do with within its own municipal power. There's no assumption of that role. It is really a consolidation of other functions that are currently existing and being exercised, again, at the federal and county level. One of the questions is what's encompassed within this proposal. And so we've depicted here in darker purple the functions that we think are within the homelessness crisis response system, and then depicted in lighter purple functions that are outside of it. And one of the key points here that we get a lot of questions, which is how is this regional authority going to affect the root causes of homelessness? And something just to be, I think, very straightforward or candid about is that this is a part of the solution, and it is not the entire solution. And so the King County Regional Homelessness Authority, as proposed, would not, for example, be able to directly force the criminal justice system to reduce any contributions that might happen as they release folks and bring them into homelessness. What it can absolutely do is to take data in a consolidated and region-wide way, see what's happening at the system level, and then feed that information back to root cause systems so that we get a little bit cleaner of an exchange of information and feedback than we have right now. And then just to depict it, that external partners, funders, collaborative, aligning along the bottom there. And this is one of our real key issues is in deciding what to propose for unification, recognizing that it cannot all be unified into one mega agency. The question is how do we maintain good and improve even better coordination between systems that would not come under direct control of the proposed King County Regional Homelessness Authority. The board structure.
Can I get you to go back to that last slide?
Yes, sir.
Please. Thank you. Sorry, keep going, yeah.
Proposed board structure, and we have in greater detail materials that can spell this out. This is an area that has taken up the majority of the public conversation around the proposed Regional Homelessness Authority, and I think it's absolutely an important one. We do want to couch the overall presentation in the proposed board structure is really a way to get at reduction of fragmentation and reduction of inequity over time. This is a construct that we came up with and developed with sort of multiple rounds of input. It eventually incorporated input from elected officials about the role that elected officials should play in a steering committee. And so that's a steering committee of 5 to 6 elected officials right now, as well as 2 persons experienced by persons who have experienced homelessness themselves, or appointed by persons who have experienced homelessness themselves. A governing board, which really does the day in, day out persistent oversight and monitoring of the PDA itself, and that is primarily populated with experts on issues that really inform how we could do homelessness services in our community. This is a different type of board than we typically create, which is usually to say seat 1 is assigned to a person with this experience, seat 2 assigned to a person with this expertise. What we've done instead is to say that the 11 seats must in composite satisfy a range of factors that are both skills and connections that we want that overall board to achieve, but it contemplates the fact that a person might actually be able to satisfy multiple of the requirements, and that we could get too descriptive with that and then have a loss of overall board composition. And then finally, an advisory committee or committees, as the legislation contemplates, that would allow a much broader input base to include providers, sub-regional planning committees if it created that, so that we get, again, full vertical integration of the overall board. I also do want to just acknowledge one of the primary points of contention, primarily in conversation with the Sound Cities Association, and also the cities that are within that organization, has been, did we get the number of elected officials from Sound Cities organizations right in this proposal? And have heard, and I think it's fair to present, quite a bit of feedback that there's a lot of interest in changing that number, and that's a conversation that we would be happy to remain involved in as we go forward. Also recognizing that it is currently before the King County Council, and that we recognize their role having the legislation at this point. So finally, we said that we were really pointed at 3 things. Equity, the first of them. So how do we improve equity? Some of it is structural. We have recognized in this community that initiatives and intent go a little bit of a way, but don't go all the way. And so how do we structurally change this? We have and we've listed these here. I think the 2 primary things that I'll point out here. One is the inclusion of persons with lived experience of homelessness or persons appointed by that community at all levels of governance. This feels really controversial to some folks, and it feels completely uncontroversial to other folks, so just to acknowledge the range of opinion. In a presentation I was doing at Microsoft on this subject, one of the pieces of feedback we got from Microsoft was, of course, it makes sense to center the user and then design a system around user experience. That's what Microsoft does. And so I just bring that example up to point out that although it might feel uncomfortable in the human services context because we typically have not operated this way, I do think it's the state of the art. We do this with seniors, we do this with veterans, we certainly see this as a best practice out of the business community, and it's really interesting, and we're excited about being able to apply that principle here in the provision of homelessness services as well. And then the other piece of this is really around board composition itself and really having a pro-equity stance on the overall composition of the board. So the legislation as proposed would require that at least a majority of the members of the governing board be identified and as members of communities and accountable to them that are disproportionately and marginalized, disproportionately represented and marginalized amongst the persons experiencing homelessness in King County. So that's just another example of some of the folks who I think have the most valuable contribution to how we can do better are the folks that the system serves least well right now. So to get back to the graphics, on the left, as you look at it, is what the auditor has observed our system currently looks like, and on the right is how we would propose through the King County Regional Homelessness Authority to unify those jurisdictions so that contractors have a single contract instead of multiple contracts, and it's clear to people to whom they would go to ask questions, make requests, or seek policy changes. How will we increase accountability? And this is our last substantive slide here. We have made tremendous strides in our community, and we've got the website up there right now. You can go there and see on a monthly updated basis the exact demographics of persons that we have within our homeless management information system right now. You can break it down by individual population types, so you can see specific information about veterans. You can see how every contracted program in our system performs right now according to its metrics, including those programs by name that are not meeting their standards, and those programs that are. And what we're excited about is taking this data infrastructure and now being able to apply it to the entire region in a uniform system so that we can now extract better information about what works and what doesn't work, and then feed that data back into a unified governance system that can apply those lessons. And we can really have conversations around what works and what doesn't work in homelessness that are informed by data and what has worked in our local community, whereas often those conversations right now contain a lot more sort of value statement or opinion, and we just want to be able to fully inform those conversations. Subject to any questions, Mr. Mayor, members of the council, that's what we've got for presentation.
Any questions? Councilmember Smith? Yep.
Thanks. I appreciate the presentation. I have a couple of different questions. One of them is, you said on the PDA there is no revenue source except coming from the participating municipalities. Does it have the ability, if, for instance, they came up with some ideas on a bigger programming change in what would potentially work, do they have the ability to go to the voters and ask for revenue, or is that something that has to go individually to the members?
So they do not, with the exception of the sort of normal processes available to anyone, but there is no ability for this public development authority to, by virtue of its own creation, put out there for vote. But they could go through an initiative or other sort of already available system.
Okay, and then one more, and then I'm sure others have questions. And that is, and I think you touched on it in here, there's nothing in this that would compel us, though, as a city to have to change our regulations or ordinances on anything unless we voluntarily wanted to. And an example of that would be, we just worked through last year a policy for homeless shelters. And there was a lot of issues, as you can imagine, that you have to work through. And I would hate to see, something come back that compels us to have to now revisit that policy or change it just because this is what the PDA is recommending or says we need to do.
You are correct, Councilmember. There is nothing in this proposed public development authority that would empower it to compel a local jurisdiction to do anything. What we are excited about is the ability to provide region-wide data to all jurisdictions, and then to also support sub-regional planning to really animate the things that local communities are identifying as important and working, while also providing from the regional level a regional overlook about what best practices are and what the data says works.
Great, thank you.
Deputy Mayor.
So one of the questions that's vexed me as soon as I saw this whole issue kind of bubbling up was the structure of the steering committee and the governing board and how those two interface together. I understand the need to have elected officials involved at some place, and the steering committee makes some sense for that. The powers of the steering committee, though, in particular, could you speak to how we landed on kind of how restrained those powers are, because the ability to steer is pretty limited, it seems.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Mayor. So the powers, as they're enumerated in the current proposed legislation, are that the steering committee can seat or must seat members of the governing board, can remove members of the governing board, can approve or turn back for revision an annual budget and a 5-year plan, and then that the steering committee is composed of members from jurisdictions that are the funders and that will undergo their normal budgeting processes in order to contribute funds. And so they would all come from organizations that remain competent to fund or not fund the PDA over time. To the other part of your question, Mr. Deputy Mayor, is with the rationale for that. In a lot of the engagement process that really occurred over the course of a year, what became very clear is that there are a lot of people who have a lot of different opinions about who has too much influence on this system. Certainly there's a narrative out there that providers have too much influence on the system. There's another narrative out there that the folks experiencing the system have too much control or too little accountability for how the system operates. There are also folks who say that governments have too much control over the system and that it changes too frequently to be able to meaningfully implement and then see through policies that we know are going to take a long time. And so this is absolutely an optimization of all three of those. How do you create a body where we really do recognize that homelessness is a specific discipline, or the services that can assist folks experiencing homelessness are specific disciplines, that it is very different discipline than, for example, affordable housing creation or other behavioral health system or other root cause systems. And so let's get expertise. Let's get them in a way where they will have the time and capacity to engage on a daily basis if necessary to ensure the system is properly constituted. And let's try to set up a system where they are free to make their decisions and then recommend recommendations in the form of a plan that is ultimately controllable by elected officials, that is ultimately subject to funding by elected officials, but do that in a way where the plan itself can come from data and their expertise and then be presented as a fully feasible option to elected officials.
Is the 5-year plan a rolling 5-year plan that comes back for approval every year, or is it something that only comes to the steering committee once every 5 years?
The legislation is actually silent on that, Mr. Deputy Mayor. I think what we've contemplated in drafting, although to be clear, it's not contained within there, is that it is a every 5 years plan, not a rolling plan, but annual budgets to that plan.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Marshall.
Thanks again for coming out. So the 5-year plan then is going to involve, I assume, citing decisions for housing and recommendations as different housing options?
Again, the legislation is silent on that level of detail. I think what we see here is that citing decisions are local decisions, that they are functions of local government, and under the principle that this PDA will not have the ability to compel any jurisdiction in that way, no. What we do anticipate, foresee, and what we're excited about, frankly, is the ability to render the data that can help us all see, where a particular type of intervention would be both appropriate and effective, or where we don't have that type of asset in the total overall system. An example of that is we have multiple cities in South King County right now, all of which are discussing the need to have year-round, not just winter-focused shelters. And so what does it look like to be able to render that data coherent, wholly, see where amongst those cities you might be able to place something like that, and then offer that as data for sub-regional planning to take from a bottom-up approach and then actually make those decisions about where they'd want to be.
There's no power of eminent domain.
No power of eminent domain for this PDA.
And I'll add one other question, which was, what is the rationale for Seattle having the 2 votes? Is it because of the proportionally a larger population of people experiencing homelessness in Seattle as compared to the county or the other cities, or what is the rationale?
So it's a good question, and this is the board question is again a place where I don't want to pretend that there are not differing opinions, that there's not controversy. One of the facts that we do see is that of that about $130 million of total overall funding that we talked about, $73 million of that is coming from the city of Seattle and that they've committed to. And so there is, from their perspective, I think a reasonable, how do we participate, also recognize that this should be regional and strike that balance in the right way. It is also a place where we do have the majority of the homeless services and persons experiencing homelessness right now. It is also true that we see, and certainly I know has been the experience of all cities, that homelessness is everywhere, and homelessness is moving. It is not, I think, over the last couple years in particular, just the city of Seattle issue that sometimes it gets characterized as.
So I think one of the concerns that I've heard is that cities have been told that funds are going to be distributed without regard to whether a jurisdiction agrees to sign on to an ILA or service agreement, yet that's not formalized anywhere. It's just something that's verbally been said, and I'm thinking something like that, if that is in fact the case, really needs to be formalized. Councilmember Dombrowski, I want to give you the opportunity here also.
Thank you, Mayor Baker, and thank you for the invitation to join you tonight to have a dialogue and listen to your questions and take your feedback down to the King County Courthouse as we work on this. I want to start by acknowledging this might be the last time in a formal way I'm able to present before 2 of your council members who are retiring, Councilmember Smith and Councilmember Danuski, and I wanted to take this opportunity to publicly express my personal, sincere, and deep appreciation for the opportunity that I've had to work with each of you on issues that are important to not only the city of Kenmore and its residents, but the region, from parks to human services, to transit. You have both been awesome leaders and just really good individual human beings, and it's been a pleasure to work with both of you. This council, I think, and the community is going to miss your service. So thank you for your work and the opportunity to work with you. Hopefully there'll be an opportunity to celebrate your work before the end of the year, but I wanted to take this moment to do that. I think Leo Floor, who is one of the brightest stars in King County government, has done an excellent job working on this proposal and advancing it. And it has a lot of merit, the notion behind the proposal to break down barriers, to deliver a unified response mechanism to a piece of the homelessness crisis, and that's kind of the crisis response. And I think it's important to bear in mind we're talking about one piece of the public response to this crisis. It does not explicitly, on purpose, address the 5 root causes of homelessness that we kind of developed around the one table methodology, things like criminal justice reform, lack of affordable housing, chemical dependency, mental health, those, and I'm forgetting one, Leo, what help me out? Foster system, yeah. So, and those, the county plays a significant role with upstream investments from VSHSL levy to the Best Starts for Kids levy to mental health drug dependency levies. We are investing upstream to reduce the inflow into, I'll call it the bathtub. That's an analogy we use. About 30,000 folks a year in King County experience homelessness. 25,000, these are round numbers, the system or they resolve that. So we've got a deficit on an annual basis of about 5,000 folks. And the way I think about it is we want to reduce the inflow where we can by making upstream investments and then add capacity to our response system to make sure folks are not on the streets or in their cars for any longer than absolutely necessary. And what we're talking about here with this $135 million between the county and the city is how do we make the most brief possible time folks living on the street. So I think there is consensus throughout the region, and it's been said by the last several mayors of the city of Seattle, that homelessness is a regional problem needing a regional response. And then the hard part comes in designing and delivering the regional response. And so just some thoughts, having sat on a bunch of the committees and working every week on this, I think that there should be a high bar to creating new governments. I'm not saying never, but I think we should be careful before we create a new government. For 60 years, the Municipal League, Jim Ellis and on, has said we need fewer special purpose governments in this county, not more. And that's the notion in large part behind King County as a regional government to deliver regional services. And I'm pretty proud of our track record. I think we don't have, frankly, a lot of the challenges that our friends at the City of Seattle have with respect to contracting and performance metrics. We have a pretty good reputation there. And I would not want to lightly create a public development authority, which is this proposal, without making sure that some measure short of that couldn't accomplish the same goal. And that, I think Leo give a nod to that, is the crux of kind of one piece of the work we're doing right now in considering this proposal. And that is pursuant to the State Interlocal Cooperation Act. Is there some way where we can have all of the benefits of combined contracting, unified accountability in terms of the dashboard, adoption of a regional plan with sub-regional planning, without creating a new government? Some of the concerns about a new government. I really believe in the fundamental basis of the people and their representative doing their work. And I don't think that there is a bigger public policy issue in our generation, not just this year, not this decade, but our generation, than this homelessness crisis. And before we as elected officials send it out to somebody else to handle, we better make sure that's really what we should be doing. I think that our values that we bring in representing the people at the table, and our accountability to the voters and our obligation to look after their money and to respond to their needs are very serious commitments that we all made when we ran for office. And I think that before we handed off the authority to that, Councilmember Herbig I like the notion there of how much steering is the steering committee able to do. We should be careful. And some of those things can be adjusted, but it is pretty limited. This notion, I will tell you, of bringing electeds in was my idea, sitting in a conference room a couple of months ago, and I appreciate the executive and the mayor adding it on. It was to try and bring electeds back to the table because the earlier concepts had no electeds. It was just the orange box. So we added those on, and then I think to the extent we were to create a PDA, you'd want to make sure that that steering committee was comprised, and I had two and two Seattle, 2 county, 2 suburban cities, the mayor and the executive. That was my suggestion. As transmitted, there was a conditional change for the Sound Cities folks to have it 1 and 1. I believe it would be pretty easy and there'd be broad consensus to tune that up and have equal representation. That, in the discussion, seems to be a very solvable problem, and probably a little more authority with respect to approving a plan and the budget. So another concern about creating this new government, when you read the charter, and this goes back to accountability and our job as electeds, is after 5 years, the proposal in here is to have the governing board become what they call a self-perpetuating board, where the appointing authority then disappears from, evaporates from the electeds, and they take care of themselves. And that's a concern for me. I believe it diminishes the accountability. While there is no authority to request taxing authority today, let's be clear. Let's be clear. The charter says in 15 under their powers that they can recommend to other political subdivisions, any of them, such tax, financing, security measures as the authority may deem appropriate to maximize the public interest of the county. And our friends at the City of Seattle absolutely want this authority to have taxing authority. Councilmember Mosqueda has told that to me, okay? They do believe we need more resources than we may, and it would take a grant of the legislature to amend the authority most likely for the PDA to have that. So I think we should be honest, while it's not in here, that there is a notion from some who want to do this that it should have taxing authority. I don't have a problem with that, but I do think if you're going to go ask for taxes, the elected folks should be making that request. So one notion is you've got elected folks today doing this kind of work. The county, for example, that can put ballot measures on, and we're accountable to voters. So accountability to the voters, oversight, transparency, those are important principles to me. I want to make sure before we create a new government that it must be done and that there isn't a way short of creating a new government to accomplish what I think are the shared objectives. Another comment, you heard about the 5-year plan. This 5-year plan is being developed, really funded by nonprofits, and we have not seen it. And it's been promised and delayed. The latest statement, the reason for the delay is somebody's been put on jury duty who's developing it back east. That's fine, but it raises a concern about who's doing the planning for the #1 public policy issue facing our region in a generation, and if it's down to one person on jury duty back east, that's a concern. Also, that we would never, no elected body, not the city council, not your council, not the county council, would ever be asked to approve that plan. I think we need, if we're gonna have a regional response to homelessness, the region to come together and have a strong launch around an agreed structure and an agreed plan. You can have sub-regional planning, but I think those are fundamental principles. With respect to the authority to impose its will on the local government, I don't think that it calls for that, the ability to do that, but there are ways to encourage, I think condition granting of funds and expenditure of resources on participation in an agreement to take action on a local basis, and I think that's something we should be careful about. I think that elected officials play an important role in this. There are 80 families, 80 people tonight, maybe 60 families, 3 blocks down here at a Mary's Place shelter, because elected officials, many in this room, brought the bureaucracy together and said, King County bureaucrats, you're gonna get them the building. Leaders in this room stood up with the community, said we're gonna welcome them. And I don't think that would have happened but for elected officials. I don't think we're always in the way. I don't think we're always counterproductive. I think more often than not, we're doing the public's business. And I want to make sure that as we reform this system and bring about all of the benefits that coordination and integration of contracting, accounting, deployment of resources does, that we don't lose that important fundamental public trust that's been placed in us. And I think a lot of that, frankly, is being driven by frustration with the Seattle City Council and a desire to maybe not have them as involved. And maybe you can understand that frustration, but there are other alternatives doing that. So that's just a few comments. I think there's more agreement than disagreement on this. I know folks are working very hard to work toward a solution. The Sound Cities Association has released a statement of principles that maybe many of you have seen coming out of their PIC, supporting, I think, regionalization of this, but raising some of the similar concerns as I've articulated about the PDA. So where I am at, I have not committed a vote one way or another. I'm dialoguing with folks like you. I'm listening, working with the executive, working with colleagues, both the SCA folks, City of Seattle folks, and colleagues on the county council, the executive, and the mayor, to see if we can't get to a yes that has broad support for this issue. And I'm happy to answer questions as well.
I guess you touched on is one of my concerns, and I know there's significant questions with SCA.
Mayor, will you talk into your microphone, please? Thank you.
And
They do that to me too.
those questions have to do with whether a new proposal would be more efficient or just simply more bureaucracy with this PDA that's talked about, Public Development Authority, PDA. And we really need to ensure the new entity is not creating additional silos with behavior, health, affordable housing, and other systems. That we have entities, and I just can't see continually forming new governmental bodies to attack a problem. I understand that we need to address this regionally, and I understand that there's some efficiencies to be gained, but the costs involved in forming a new government agency just takes money away from addressing the problem. And that really concerns a number of us.
Mr. Mayor, if I might, the cost on this startup are not insignificant, probably in the $2 to $3 million range, if I'm recalling Leo estimate. There would be, I think it's fair to say, some ongoing kind of overhead costs for accounting and staff and that kind of things. And that's one of the things I'm suggesting we explore as to whether or not this could be housed at, or even not housed at, using the services of King County we have very good procurement, we have great legal, HR, those kind of things, so we're not reinventing the wheel. Your notion about siloing is an important one because again, this is a piece of it. I do worry that creating a new government where you'd have to have interlocal agreements back to King County and others could slow down a response. I am so proud of our government. If there is a guy that I would want in charge of this public crisis, it's this gentleman right here. It really is, and he runs the Department of Community and Human Services, and I know his commitment to this and his expertise as a manager and leader, and I just want to make sure that we don't peel off this unit and inhibit our ability to deliver the wraparound services, chemical dependency and mental health, placement into a permanent supportive housing, prevention upstream in terms of rent and utilities, those kind of things. His department does a lot of that today directly and through contract, and maybe he doesn't want the job. It's an impossible job to some degree, but that's something we should really, really look at from a management and government structure perspective, right? Let's get this right.
Councilmember Shrubnik, then we'll just go
Just
down the way.
couple of questions. I think these are, well, maybe for either of you, but I guess one of the questions is that in terms of efficiency, would the new entity serve as the continuum of care to kind of essentially replace all home? So that would be an efficiency. Is that, I'm seeing nods. Yeah.
Correct, Councilmember.
Okay.
The proposal has the regional authority as the continuum of care.
Right, okay.
Can I clarify that though, Leo? You help me, but I believe the All Home Board voted to remain as kind of at least an advisor, having some continued authority under the federal continuum of care requirement. So they would not disappear under is that right?
No, you get alignment, so you get so the continuum of care and the continuum of care board are actually separate legal entities, and I won't bore everybody with the details. But what we would propose is that or have proposed is the regional authority becomes the continuum of care lead agency. There is an additional federal requirement for a continuum of care board that must exist, and that would be the advisory committee depicted underneath the governing board on the graphic you all saw, and that's actually separate right now, and it's one of those four circles that the auditor rendered as separate.
Great. And my second question is, again, in terms of efficiency and alignment, back in the day, a decade or 15 years ago, we used to have joint NOFAs, joint notices of funding announcement, and funding availability. And I guess what my question is how would this new entity foster work like that, bringing together Seattle and King County in particular? Would it be disruptive to that? I mean, what's your sense of that?
Thank you, Councilmember. We have joint NOFAs right now. And what we see is that and this is the movement from Committee to End Homelessness to All Home to now this proposal that I depicted earlier. What we found is that joint NOFAs are not enough, that we need to unify data, that we need to unify contracting, that we need to unify performance measurement, that we need to unify accountability, and not just the NOFAs. And so I think this would build upon that foundation.
Thanks.
So if All Home is continuing, will one table continue too?
One table is over, Mr. Mayor, as an effort, although we do still adopt and use its framework about the 5 root causes, but one table has included as a process.
Councilwoman Curtis.
So obviously one of our goals is to improve the efficiency of our resources so we can provide more service for the same amount of money. And I look at the resources in two groups, staff and money. So right now there are people in King County and Seattle and the other cities, and it sounds like a bunch of other agencies and groups that are responsible for things. Will those people be used in this new structure, or is a whole new structure with a whole bunch of new people going to be created and we don't get rid of anybody? In which case that doesn't feel like efficiency to me. So a people question, if you want to answer that one first, then we'll go to the money question.
Happy to, Councilmember. So the entire concept is premised upon the fact that any function and the people and the funding that support it currently at All Home, King County, the City of Seattle, would cease to exist there and would only exist in a new public development authority and then be deployed more efficiently. And this is the example where right now there's a person that I'm responsible for that oversees a contract for solid ground to provide services. That same program receives a contract from the City of Seattle that is overseen by a contract monitor at the City of Seattle, paid for by City of Seattle, and it is unnecessary that both of them have the same job. And that is a very specific example that both my colleagues at the City of Seattle and us at the Department of Community and Human Services are just keenly aware exists and want to be able to solve through a program like this. We have premised the entire proposal, and this is what the legislation says, on budget neutrality, that we will not spend additional ongoing funds on anything we've proposed here, although Councilmember Dombowski correctly does depict that there is a startup cost that we have articulated at about $1.5 million from King County.
Would some of those people move from one location to another, or they would fulfill a new function with a new responsibility in their present location?
We contemplate so no duplication here. We contemplate fully not having that work at King County, not having those people at King County, that there would be a new regional authority, that it would employ folks, and that it would be able to administer current administration amounts of money more efficiently than we do right now.
Okay. And then the money question. So the $130 million, will this entity be the one responsible for spending that $130 million, or it will be an entity that creates policies, directions, recommendations, and it actually goes to King County and Seattle and the other cities to actually spend the money?
This entity would be incompetent to budget any local funds without them already having been budgeted by either the City of Seattle or King County in this case. All funding retains its existing restrictions. So, for example, we would project right now that some funding from the Veteran Seniors and Human Services levy would be provided to the regional authority. That one would have to be used pursuant to King County's budgeting process and what the county says it must be used for, and then two would have to be spent contingent on the council-approved and Regional Policy Committee-approved implementation plan for that levy as well. And all of our funding sources have some version of that baseline purpose or use, either through the budgeting system and or as a condition of the money itself.
So I understand that the budgeting is controlled by those other entities. Would this be the entity that actually spends the money?
It would be. So it would look a lot like my department's function right now. We receive policy direction in the form of budgets and implementation plans that are enacted in ordinance, and then we procure pursuant to that. We do make decisions within that sort of implementation range within the executive branch, but are not making major policy changes at our level. The other way to just answer the question, with complete candor is we have set in place a structure where the regional authority can make proposals about what those policies could and should be in the form of a 5-year plan, which is a different document than the regional action plan that Councilmember Dabowski was describing, although it's confusing in the structure of it. And so none of those plans gets approved without the steering committee composed primarily of elected officials approving that plan.
Kind of a related question, that would this proposal, I hadn't listened closely enough or hadn't seen it visually, that there was a steering committee. I didn't realize that, with a lot of electeds at that level. So that made me feel more comfortable, but then when I heard that would go away in 5 years, that made me less comfortable. So is there any discussion that maybe that committee wouldn't disappear in 5 years?
I apologize. Again, it's not a, ordinances don't necessarily make for compelling reading. The way that we've structured it is that the steering committee is persistent, would not go away, it must be there. It is the governing board, which is initially appointed into their positions and then confirmed by the steering committee. After 5 years, that would be the governing board proposing to the steering committee itself who the governing board members would be, but the steering committee still having the ability and the requirement to confirm members to the board.
So there would always be that electeds involved at that level?
Yes, Councilmember.
Councilmember Smith, and Deputy Mayor.
Well, thank you for that, actually, that last explanation, because that was a lot of what I was trying to understand as who spends the money and how it gets spent, and so that helps. The other thing is, and this is kind of based on what Councilmember Dembowski said, and it has to do with the fact that they actually may have the ability to raise revenues. Is that correct? Because I think what you told me was different than what Councilmember Dembowski told me, and I just want to make sure I understand that.
They can recommend the raising of revenues to the state, county, or city. And you all correct me if I'm wrong, but I do believe there is an interest, at least in some of the players here, in having this authority be able to have the ability to directly raise revenues and seeking that authority from Olympia. Or wherever you'd need to get it from, but I think Olympia.
Okay. And what I can, I am not here to I have full respect for Councilmember Dembowski and his role as a council member. What I can just reflect is sort of the factual context around drafting. There are folks who think there should be more revenue, and there are folks who think there should not be more revenue. And so this proposal embodies a very explicit factor, and this is one of the reasons why the PDA is the form, that there is not an ability to raise revenue in this proposal. And Councilmember Dembowski is absolutely correct that it could say that it needs more revenue, but we, in drafting, saw that it is very different than saying that it can create its own revenue, that it ought to be able to make a policy recommendation, but it ought not to be competent to affect that policy.
Okay, thanks for the clarification. And the reason, I think it's really critical, because what that really gets down to then who is representing this organization, and it really gets to the crux of having electeds involved. And from a credibility standpoint, I think it's absolutely vital that it, like you said, 2, 2, and 2, or something like that. That's really important because you're not going to get buy-in from a lot of suburban cities if it's a Seattle-centric based organization. And if they are going to go for revenues at some point, and what organization that's government-based doesn't eventually go there? It's inevitable. We know it's the biggest crisis around, so we know that will happen. And so if we know that will happen, I think it is that much more critical that the suburban cities have an important role, even if the initial upfront revenue stream is more weighted towards Seattle now. That's natural, because that's where the middle of the problem has kind of, it's like the puddle, it's kind of just expanded from there. But if you're going to go to the voters and ask for something, or you're going to go from some other revenue source that impacts all those cities, then that means they all have an equal say in it. So I think it's really, really important that the electeds, however the structure is, have an important role and continue to have an important role, so that it adds credibility and a higher level of transparency to the process.
I think it's worth remembering, Councilmember Smith, that Seattle, I think, is about 700,000 of 2.25 million people in the county, and the rest of the cities in unincorporated area are the balance. So you can measure it different ways, but 222 seemed to me to be walking our talk on a regional response. In the north end, on our one-night count, our numbers are relatively low, growing, but relatively low. Seattle has about 3,000 unsheltered folks on any one night, but South King County has near that number, 2,800. So this suburbanization of poverty, the challenges of homelessness are definitely no longer a Seattle-only crisis, and that's why you hear this mantra of a regional response being necessary. Our funding mechanism isn't quite there yet, right? People are doing different levels of what they can afford. We got little cities up here in the north end. Your budgets are just like this, as you know, right? There, you got to run a bond to do sidewalks.
Just
City of Seattle with the sales tax revenue and the REIT revenue, I mean, they have more resources.
Right, and just so you know, I'm not against this. I actually think it makes sense to approach it regionally. I just think in order for it to be effective, it's going to have a lot of more solid representation, because it's because Seattle doesn't have a strong track record on how they've dealt with a lot of issues. Mm-hmm. And in order to have that credibility, I think you need to have more involvement.
If I might, Brent, just one additional thought. Like I said, I don't think there's anybody who I'd rather have that I've met than Leo be in charge of this. And again, he may not want it, but the two goals of being more efficient and consolidating our response and reducing inequality are good goals. But I have to confess, disappointed in the underwhelming nature of them. When I started on this particular process, working on this a few months ago, I said the acid test of success is, do we have fewer people unsheltered on the streets in 5 years? And that is not the promise of this proposal today. And that, I think we have to ask ourselves, if that is not what we expect to accomplish in 5 years, materially impacting in a positive way the number of people unsheltered on the streets. 180 people died last year or so, right? 180 died before that. What are we doing?
So, Councilmember Dombowski, correct me if I misheard you, but were you suggesting earlier that you would like to see, instead of a separate PDA, have everything folded under King County? Is that a thing? Is that an idea that you've been thinking about?
It is an idea that I think is worth considering, and that is having it a separate division in his Department of Community and Human Services, so it could fully integrate. A number of years ago, we looked at, should we merge DCHS and the Department of Public Health? And we studied that, and we determined, no, they should cooperate more closely together, but don't merge them. I think we are the regional government, and I'm proud of our government. I think, we're not always perfect, but you can call me, and I'm going to hopefully be accountable to the voters in our district, and we have representation from around the county. And I think there's some efficiencies there. To be honest with you, a number of politicians in the county may not want that to shoulder that responsibility, because what happens if you fail? you know? So that's one option, Councilmember Herberg. Another approach is more of a, think of it a partnership, which is envisioned under the Interlocal Cooperation Act, right? There are cooperating means short of forming a separate legal government that we could enter into to do this, and we're working with the lawyers at Pacifica, and they've got a chart, and we're just looking at that to see if that might be a way to go. And the reason I'm interested in that is because it keeps all the electeds where they sit today, right? The City of Seattle, the County Council, our Sound Cities partners. You're not moving them around. They retain their authority, but we have a partnership agreement. We have all of the benefits that this could bring. The governing board could be applied to that. The plans could be adopted and implemented. And see if, so that's what we're exploring.
Okay, I mean, yeah, I kind of understand where you're coming from with the idea of possibly folding things into King County. I just don't know how you would get Seattle to sign off and hand King County a check for $74 million.
Well, that's a good
if
question.
They didn't have the oversight on, the money.
Today-
And this is one way to kind of
Yeah.
get everybody
So
together.
I've thought about that, Nigel, if I might, and in my communications with their council members, and we're working in kind of this G11 group or G12, I said, they're already indicating a willingness to write a $75 million check, give it away, right, to a new entity over which they are not the majority people in charge. So that's interesting. And today, they write us a check every year for $25 million to our public health department. They have written checks like that for 4 decades pursuant to about a 5-page interlocal agreement. It's worked really well. They write us a $45 million check every year for transit. They passed Prop 1 when we couldn't do it countywide, and that's pursuant to a contract. The City of Seattle writes us big checks to work on regional problems, so I don't know that it's totally foreign in terms of a concept.
All right, thanks.
Any other questions? So I guess the question at hand is, at some point, the sheet in front of you is what SCA's questions are. And we're going to have to make a decision. Do we support SCA and the questions of the other cities in the organization? Or do we just sign on with the county for what's been presented? So, Councilmember Smith.
So are you asking, and I mean this sincerely, are you asking us to sign on to this without knowing how the structure is going to be?
How which?
What the final structure is going to be?
Well, I believe that's what the question is. Where SCA has got some serious questions about what the structure is and a number of other issues.
Okay.
As indicated on the sheets that you were given. So.
I understand, but like the sheet says, let's just go to your third paragraph, the third bullet point. It says, questions remain about how signatories would extricate themselves from the structure if it does not work.
Right.
So, I mean, that's an example of something I'm trying to understand, do you want us to approve what this is now without knowing the answers?
We want to know the answer to that question
Okay.
before Sound City signs on.
Okay.
We want these questions answered to the suburban city's satisfaction before we sign on.
Okay.
Right now, I don't think, most of the cities want to sign on to this, to get these questions answered.
Okay.
And so I think that's the question that we're looking at. But anyway, thank you, guys.
Thank you. If I can, I know
Please.
I've over-talked, maybe talked 4 years of talking in one night, but I want to just, again, take a moment to recognize this council and your city administration for not running away from, but standing up and supporting in a real meaningful way, more lifting above, punching above your weight, participation in responding to this crisis. The Mary's Place shelter at Kenmore was a big deal, and you came to the meeting, we talked to the community, and you did what we needed to do on the zoning and the permitting, and then you haven't walked away. You've come and supported the shelter on a continual basis. You've also worked with the faith community here, right? And their efforts to also help respond to this crisis. And I will say that it's not every city in the county that has your track record. There's some cities where their program would be buy bus tickets. All right, just to put it bluntly. And you haven't done that. And I think that I'm really proud to work in partnership with you, and I think you all should be proud of the approach you've taken because it's been compassionate and it's been smart and it's been effective. And I think that approach here can deliver similar results.
I think we have a very strong feeling and opinion when it comes to the housing crisis that the region is facing now. I know that serving on the Regional Affordable Housing Task Force, one of the principles that I had put in there was to work with the faith community. And we're seeing that up the road here with a number of affordable housing units being built up there, or the plans to build them up there. We're also seeing the potential with St. Vincent de Paul developing a line of affordable housing on their property and doing some major redevelopment there. So affordable housing is very, very important to us. We understand the issues, and so, yeah. So thank you. Thank you all for your time and coming out tonight and answering our questions.
Call me anytime, obviously, if you got feedback, email me or cajole me or kick me.
All right. Next item on the agenda. We'll do that later. I don't need it right this minute, but yeah, we'll come back to it. Hello. Mike, there we go. All right, so next item on the agenda then is City of Kenmore's 2020 State Legislative Agenda. Mr. Karlinsey, and I see we're joined by our lobbyist, Bryan.
All right, it's that time of year again where we update our state legislative agenda, which are the main requests we have of the state legislature. We always try to get this done well in advance of when session starts in January. And so we have here our two amazing lobbyists with Gordon Thomas Honeywell here tonight to kind of walk you through what our proposed legislative agenda is. So,
great.
Brianna and Shelley, take it away.
Yes, thank you. And Mayor, Deputy Mayor, members of the council, Brianna Murray and Shelley Helder, we're very pleased to be here this evening. Not necessarily looking forward to the rainy drive home, but and found your previous presentation to be very intriguing and interesting, so didn't mind sitting through that at all. This evening, our goal for tonight's discussion is to provide you with an overview of what to expect during the upcoming 2020 legislative session, review a proposed 2020 state legislative agenda, and then outline for you a timeline on how we are going to prepare for the forthcoming session. In the interest of time, I'm going to dive right into an overview of what to expect in 2020. It's the second year of the 2-year legislative biennium. It's scheduled to last 60 days and is commonly referred to as a short legislative session. As a short legislative session, the focus of the legislature will be on amending their existing operating, capital, and transportation budgets that were adopted in 2019. Just briefly, the status of each of those updates. The operating budget, which you'll remember funds the K through 12 education system as well as all state agencies, is about a $52 billion budget. The latest revenue forecast suggests that revenues for the 2019-21 biennium are up around $440 million. In a $52 billion budget, that's a drop in the bucket, so not a significant change in revenue, but it is good to see that it's on a slightly upward trend. The capital budget is a $3 billion budget. The 2019 legislature reserved $70 million in bonds to make investments in the supplemental year. So we're looking at a supplemental capital budget between $70 and $80 million. And then the transportation budget is the budget that has most constrained in revenue. You have a measure on the November ballot called Initiative 976 that, if approved, would further constrain revenue within the transportation budget. Regardless of whether Initiative 976 passes, there's significant conversation around the next transportation revenue package. Last session, we saw the Senate propose a proposal called Forward Washington that was the next large round of investments. We anticipate that this year we will see the House outline some sort of a plan on how they would like to see transportation revenue move forward, and I expect that that plan will be developed, again, regardless of what happens with Initiative 976. If Initiative 976 does pass, it's very possible, if not likely, that we will see cuts to the existing 2019-21 transportation budget, as well as in future years in 21 and onward. You'll remember in 2015, the legislature enacted a 16-year transportation plan, and they've been in the progress of implementing that. And so they would be making adjustments to that plan to reflect any downward revenue. In addition to working on making amendments to those three budgets, all of the bills that were introduced in the 2019 legislative session are automatically reintroduced and carry over into the 2020 legislative session. And then probably another 1,500 to 2,000 bills will be introduced. And amongst all of those, hundreds of bills will impact city business, and we track and weigh in on those at varying levels.
So we'd like to provide just a little bit of context for the political climate for the 2020 session, and largely it will remain unchanged from the 2019 session. Democrats will continue to hold the majorities in all three chambers, the House, Senate, and the Governor's Mansion. Following the 2020 session, the entire House and half the Senate will be up for re-election, as is the case every 2 years. And then following the 2020 election, there will be a redistricting. So after the 2020 census, of course, there's a redistricting to ensure that there's equal representation amongst all legislative districts. And so, and following the 2020 cycle is when we'll see what the impacts of that redistricting will be.
So tonight we would like to talk about the development of your 2020 legislative agenda. But before we dive into that, I wanted to just review some of the guidance that we've provided to you in previous years, but continues to be our guidance as we look toward this year's legislative agenda. So the first is remembering that the legislative process is truly a 2-year process. As cities, we have a tendency to think of the legislative session as the 2019 session and then very separately the 2020 session. But from the legislature's perspective, it's a 2-year process, the long session followed by a short session. So what we've done and what we recommend you continue to do is to take your 2019 legislative agenda and make amendments to it for the 2020 session. Remove those items we've accomplished and keep those things that we need to continue to work on. We also encourage you to take into account the political climate and context that Shelley and I have just outlined for you, so that what you're asking for lines up with what's reasonable in Olympia. Keeping the agenda concise and easily comprehensible. Always am a stickler for suggesting that it remain on one page, which I think the draft before you does. There may be some special formatting, but it's on one page. And that there is some consistency from year to year. We don't want to give our legislative delegation or others whiplash as we struggle with where we want to go, but building on previous successes and building that consistency. The other thing I'll note is that your legislative agenda is really comprised of 2 different documents. It's your top page legislative agenda, which we encourage your legislative delegation to focus on. And then the second page, which is your 2020 policy statements. That's really direction to city staff and Shelley and myself on how to weigh in on all of those other hundreds of bills that impact city business. So you just a reminder that you have that 2-document structure.
And to Brianna's last point, building on successes, we did have a number of items on the 2019 Kenmore legislative agenda that we were able to accomplish in the first year of the biennium. And so just as a refresher for all of us, there was a request for $150,000 to do the minor improvements at Twin Springs Park. We ended up securing $155,000 for that project. And that was one of our capital budget requests of the 2019 session. Our other capital budget request was $2 million for Lake Washington Loop Trail, and this is something that we'll continue to keep on the agenda, and Brianna will touch on it more in a minute. The transportation budget from the 2019 session, as it was alluded to, it was very constrained, will continue to be constrained. We had two requests related to the transportation budget. One was transfer of funding from 522 West B project to West Sammamish Bridge, and this was in order to ensure that the West Sammamish Bridge project continues to move forward on schedule. That funding transfer was a little bit politically sensitive, and so it was a big deal that we were able to accomplish that transfer given the previous statements that had been made about not transferring funds from one project to another. So Representative Valdez from the 46th delegation was the one that really spearheaded that effort on the city's behalf, and has committed to continuing to work with us on funding for 68th Avenue Northeast. And then lastly, the Aquatic Land Enhancement Account. This is a competitive grant program that the city applied for and was ranked on. And what's significant about this program is that when the governor develops his budget and when the House and the Senate develop their budget, they have recommended funding levels. And the governor's budget, his recommended funding level was below the amount that would have allowed the city to receive any funding from this account. And same with the House proposal. And so it really was the Senate's capital budget and really Senator Frocht who came forward for the city in developing a budget that allowed the city to receive $500,000 for Squires Landing and $470,000 for Log Boom Park. So that, I want to emphasize that funding would not have been there but for the Kenmore delegation really standing up and representing this community's priorities.
So as you can see from the 2019 session, there really was a mixed bag. We had some really good successes, and particularly with Twin Springs Park and the West Sammamish Bridge transfer, some successes within the capital and transportation budget, but we have some more work to do in 2020. So with that being said, the first on your 2020 state legislative agenda is picking up where we left off from last session, which is requesting funding for the Lake Washington Loop Trail. Last session, we requested $2 million for the trail. The draft agenda in front of you revises that downward to $1 million. That is at the recommendation of myself and Shelley to reflect the fact that this year is a non-budget year. It's a supplemental budget year, and therefore the dollar amounts that are awarded to projects tend to be smaller. On average, they're closer to the between $250,000 and $500,000 range, so $1 million request in a supplemental year is a fairly ambitious request. However, because this was on the agenda last year, we didn't want to go any lower than $1 million. The agenda before you requests $1 million. As a reminder, but as I'm sure you're all aware, this is to make improvements along 3 miles of Juanita Drive Northeast, and you've seen some significant safety issues for pedestrians and bicycles along this corridor. You've already received funding through Sound Transit and have some funding allocated to the project through the Walkways and Waterways bond measure. So this $1 million will help close that funding gap to help complete the project.
If I can just add to that. So the capital improvement program that you recently adopted about a month ago shows Juanita Drive and 68th Avenue as fully funded even without this $1 million. This $1 million request from the state, what it does is it's some recognition that this is a regional corridor that this is serving. And it also would take pressure off city sources of funding to this project, and it would also be a hedge against bid estimates coming in high, or the actual bids coming in high. So technically there is not a funding gap because your CIP has it fully funded, but for the reasons I just mentioned, I think it's worth going to the state and asking for help.
The next item on the 2020 draft legislative agenda is, again, the request for $450,000 for 68th Avenue Northeast pedestrian and bicycle safety improvements. This is, again, another item that It's partially funded through the Walkways and Waterways bond measure, and then as well as the city has dedicated significant resources to this project. I think this $450,000 was included in the draft proposal of the House Transportation budget last year, and really didn't make it across the finish line only because the final transportation budget had to be cut so significantly. So we feel good about this being a reasonable request, given that it was a request made in the first half of the biennium, and then it's in the dollar range that would be reasonable in a supplemental year. Again, I'll caveat that all with what Brianna mentioned earlier about the uncertainty around the outcome of Initiative 976 and the impact that may have on the state's transportation revenues.
And I'll just add, I was in a meeting earlier today with the chair of the House Transportation Committee, and he communicated very clearly. He said no existing projects are safe, let alone requesting any funding for new projects. To kind of go back to our guidance on developing the legislative agenda, the viability of this request in terms of the current political climate does depend fairly significantly on what happens with the November ballot.
And then the bottom half of the legislative agenda is kind of getting at kind of a broader perspective on some of the city priorities. So as Brianna mentioned, the legislature is considering the initial development of the next statewide transportation package. And last session, the Senate Transportation Chair, Senator Steve Hobbs, put forward his proposal, which was referred to as Forward Washington. And Representative Jake Fye has indicated his desire to develop a similar proposal from the House's perspective. What we have recommended on this draft legislative agenda is some of the priority items from the city of Kenmore's perspective of if that package begins to be developed in this 2020 session, which we anticipate it will, though we don't anticipate it making it over the finish line in 2020, making sure that we have the Kenmore priorities on paper so that the city's delegation is aware of the items we'd like to see included in that discussion. The first item, local revenue options for maintenance and preservation. Really, this kind of gets at what was spoken to earlier in your meeting about sidewalks and providing resources for preservation. There was a Joint Transportation Committee report that was released earlier this year that highlighted the significant shortfall for cities when it comes to maintenance and preservation, and it was in the $900 million range, and that's over and above what cities are already allocating to maintenance and preservation. So I'm sure you all experience it here, and it was reflected in the report. And so really this priority is building on that acknowledgement that this is not just a challenge for Kenmore, but for cities statewide. And then 61st Avenue sidewalk replacement again, but this is more of a specific targeted request. This is an identified project that the city knows needs to be fixed and doesn't have the resources to do so right now. And then the last item is the reconnecting Kenmore's downtown to Lake Washington. You may recall a couple years ago, the state legislature provided funding for the city to complete a study to determine the feasibility of an over or under crossing to reconnect Kenmore's downtown to the waterfront. And that work, I think, will be beginning in early 2020 and wrapping up at the end of 2020. And so we'll have a better sense of what that project may look like moving forward.
Shelley, if I can just interject one thing, I want to make a comment on the timing around the Forward Washington priorities outlined in your legislative agenda. These are included really in helping develop some long-term priorities. There's no expectation that a revenue package would get across the finish line during the 2020 session. The earliest that a revenue package, the next revenue package would pass would be in 2021. However, similar to what we saw when the Connecting Washington package was developed, the legislature is going to take several years to develop their project list, identify the appropriate revenue sources, dot the I's and cross the T's. It's in the city's best interest to put our priorities out there early in that development process as opposed to later. So these items are on your agenda for 2020, but there should be relatively little expectation that we get them accomplished. I would say a signal of good progress is that in proposals that are developed this next session, that these items are discussed, mentioned, included, referenced, and that we've had a discussion with our delegation about their willingness to advocate for them within that dialogue.
And then the next item is a sustainable fiscal structure for cities. And this is alluding to, actually explicitly stating that 40% of your city general fund comes from property tax, and that is statutorily capped at 1%. And so recognizing that there needs to be an adjustment to the property tax cap, but also possibly other considerations, because even with lifting that cap, a community like Kenmore with limited sales tax revenue is still constrained in the amount of revenue growth given the increasing costs that you all have. So that's what that item speaks to. And then the last item is really a request that's being spearheaded by Kenmore Air. And this is a request for safety buoys on the north end of Lake Washington. And this is a request that they had last session and we supported through a letter. And it's a request that they're planning on advancing again in this supplemental budget year.
And just to clarify, they're requesting the funding, and the funding would go to Department of Natural Resources to then implement the project. So the city's exclusively playing a supportive advocacy role for Kenmore Air. There's no funding recipient or administrative function if they receive their funding. Just briefly, before we move on to the timeline, I wanted to talk about the 2020 policy statements. They're generally very similar to what we've seen in 2019 and in previous years. However, I wanted to highlight a few items that align with AWC's legislative priorities, so you have good awareness of what the association is advocating for and where you're aligning with the association and your priorities. The first of that is around tax increment financing. This is an item that we've added to your policy statement. The Association of Washington Cities has outlined that they plan on pushing for true tax increment financing, which requires a constitutional amendment in order to allow property tax revenue increases within development areas to be allocated to infrastructure within those revitalization areas. That constitutional amendment would be coupled with an effort to try and reauthorize a program called Local Revitalization Financing, which is a tax increment financing light program that the state funded in the early to mid 2000s and has since been mothballed. So AWC is pushing forward both those proposals this upcoming session, and the language in your policy statements would call on us to support and participate in their efforts. The second of AWC's priority. Oh, yeah.
So I know you just explained tax increment financing, and I still don't have a clue what you just said.
Sure.
Can you a little more?
It's
downgrade one more notch.
It's certainly complicated, and I also invite Rob to chime in here as well. But I'll take a stab at it first. So generally speaking, tax increment financing says that you need an area that needs to be redeveloped. But in order for that area to be redeveloped, you have to provide some level of infrastructure, and you need to identify the funding for that infrastructure. The funding that you use to build out that infrastructure is the future property tax revenues that would come in after it were redeveloped. So it allows you to kind of borrow against that future revenue that would come in, make the infrastructure, and make the infrastructure investments. You want to add anything?
That works. That's what I thought it was talking about, but none of the words made any sense.
Before we get too deep in questions here, I've got some people waiting to ask questions. So.
Oh, okay. So the second of AWC's priorities that aligns with your policy statements is around affordable housing. The association in the past has been very supportive of identifying new revenue tools as well as new funding sources for affordable housing. We're seeing that conversation continue into the upcoming session. I would say there's really a lot of discussion around 3 different proposals. And very briefly, the first is around potential changes to the multifamily property tax exemption, and there are many different iterations of what that could look like. yet to be determined. The second is authorizing cities and counties to impose a councilmanic sales tax to fund affordable housing. And the third is authorizing cities and counties to impose some type of a real estate excise tax to fund affordable housing. Those would all be local options. Your policy statement does not indicate a particular preference or statement on each of those proposals. Instead, as those proposals are developed in greater detail, we would work with your city staff and get feedback and weigh in on those as they are developed. And the final one of AWC's priorities that lines up with your policy statement is around funding for the Public Works Assistance Account and continuing to encourage the legislature to fully fund that account rather than sweep revenues away from it.
Okay, so what's next? What does this all mean for you? So September, October timeframe is when state agencies are developing their requests to the governor for amendments to the biennial budget. Those proposals, I guess, actually now that we're into October, have been submitted, and the governor's working on developing his supplemental budget. In November, we're hoping to finalize amendments to the city's draft legislative agenda and policy statements. So if you have feedback or recommendations, please do let us or city staff know. And then prior to the beginning of session, we'll meet with the delegation members, brief them on the city's priorities and other items that covered in tonight's presentation. Session begins January 13th, the second Monday of the month. And then during the legislative session, we would hope that you all would come down to Olympia and meet with the legislators and for us to work with you in advancing the city's priorities.
I think with that, we are happy to answer all these
Deputy
questions.
Mayor.
Two things. So you alluded to it a little bit when you were talking about potential Ford Washington or sustainable fiscal structures for cities. When you're talking about a potential local revenue options for maintenance preservation, you talk about new resources, a funding package that provides new resources for cities for maintenance and preservation of existing transportation systems, with the possibility of IMA's initiative passing and us losing $300,000 a year in car tabs. That is a major concern that we have as a city, and beyond just asking the state for more money to the locals, which we should be asking for, I would like it called out more explicitly that we're asking for new revenue tools in our toolkit because we may need those sooner than later. And then second, I'm not 100% sold on tax increment financing. I'm not sure if I'm willing to fight about it too much, but I'm just learning a little bit more about it. I'm not quite sold on it as a idea yet. I understand people want the tool, but I don't know if I'm completely comfortable with us signing in on that stuff, but that's just me. So thank you.
May I talk about tax increment financing? We were in our last legislative agenda, when we still had hope for Lake Point, we were asking for a tax increment financing tool for Lake Point with no defined Lake Point project, but the potential for a Lake Point project to come back to life. I'm hoping to have tax increment financing as a tool for Lake Point. The problem with tax increment financing is it could be, if you're not careful with it, it could go to subsidize projects that would have been profitable without tax increment financing. And I've had conversations with Senator Frocht about this. I'm in favor of tax increment financing when the project's not viable without it. Senator Frocht and I would use what we call but-for language. So but-for tax increment financing, the project wouldn't work. And so we even talked about how the legislation could include but-for language so that a project would have to demonstrate that it can't go forward without some tax increment help.
I mean, part of my concern with tax increment financing, I didn't want to start a whole discussion around it right now because it's super complicated and I don't pretend to understand all of the nooks and crannies of it. But if we make a bad bet on a place and we do the tax increment financing and then the development falls through, or the tax revenue doesn't appear that we predicted, then the rest of the city is on the hook covering for somebody's failed development or somebody's development that isn't living up to what our expectations were when we passed it. So, and that's getting into the local, specifics, but,
And there's things we can do to protect ourselves against that, like creating a separate public development, no, not public development authority. That's what we were just talking about earlier. What's the term? Help me out here. Something like that. But yeah, there's things we can do to protect ourselves against what you just described. So, all right.
And if I can also just clarify, there's tax increment financing and using it in the manner that I described earlier with property tax requires a constitutional amendment. The local revitalization financing program is a program that the state has authorized in previous years, and it provides the city with a credit against the state sales tax in order to make infrastructure improvements in one of those areas. However, in order to receive the credit against the state sales tax, you have to generate an increase in property and sales tax within that area. And whatever the increase is the amount of credit that you get. So just to distinguish that there's kind of two programs, two concepts being talked about moving forward on parallel tracks. One that requires a constitutional amendment, the other that requires a fair amount of significant state funding.
all right, thanks. Councilmember Shrubnik.
One thing, the Model Toxic Control Act, my understanding is that Bothell received some funds for this for their downtown development property that they own, and that this fund is restricted to property that is publicly owned. So I guess I'm wondering whether there could be work on that to include public-private partnerships. Lake Point, again, comes to mind. I mean, this is a project that needs a tremendous amount of work and environmentally, and any additional resources would be extremely helpful.
Yeah, there was actually fairly large reform MATCA bill that passed just last session that actually Senator Frocht was one of the champions of that bill. And it invested significant new resources into the program. So I don't think that there's opposition to anything that would allow for public-private partnerships, but you're correct that as the program is currently structured, the property has to be either privately or publicly owned, or there has to be some type of agreement that would indicate the property would be publicly owned in the near future.
So is there, well, anyway, so that if I were adding to this legislative agenda, I would request that.
Yeah, I think we can explore that as well as brownfield redevelopment funding. When we initially started working on the Lake Point site, we looked at both of those accounts as potential resources. And the challenge with both of those as revenue sources is that the dollar amount levels that they provide are not, we're not significant enough to move the Lake Point project forward. And so that's what transitioned us to look more at something like tax increment financing. Given where things are now at with the site, we can revisit that conversation and look at what those different options would be. And Rob, I'm looking to you to see if there's any other thoughts you want to add.
No, to get at what Councilmember Shrubnik is suggesting, maybe we could add a statement in our policy statements on page 2 that encourages flexibility for public-private partnerships and/or expanding the MOTCA account, something like that.
Yeah, or if you would be amenable, not just MOTCA, but also brownfield redevelopment and other environmental cleanup programs, which might give us some flexibility to really explore a lot of different options and see which one is, easiest to pull the lever on in terms of public ownership.
Right. I think the issue is that this is in the public interest, even if it's largely privately held, and there's just a partnership issue. So, yeah.
And I would agree with Brianna's recommendation that it speak to the broader resources. There are significant limitations with MATCA, not just that there's limited funding in the account, but also that it does require a 50% match. So if you receive $2 million from MATCA, you have to put in $2 million in order to receive that full benefit.
Councilmember Smith.
Good evening. I had a question on the sustainable fiscal structure for cities, and where you specifically were asking for lifting the 1% cap on property tax. I'm just curious, I would assume that has a very slim chance of anything. Is that more just making a statement, or is there actually a push that's got viability to make that happen?
Well, yeah. We found that we say often the same things at the same time, so it doesn't matter which of us talks. But so I think first off, I want you to be aware that last session, Representative Jerry Paulette, your legislator, introduced a bill directly on this subject and really took it on in a leading way. We saw the state have a very robust discussion around the 1% property tax cap. However, that was the year that they also implemented the McCleary solution, and at the time, there was divided government, so the Senate was majority Republican and the House majority Democrat. I think there's some question as to, now that there are strong Democrat majorities in both chambers, and I don't think this next session, but again, thinking more long-term, does there become a point in the future where that 1% cap and lifting it becomes a realistic request to make of the legislature? The state lifted the 1% cap for themselves for a period of 4 years, and so at some point they're going to either need to revisit that sunset for themselves, or it will lapse, in which case there may be friends in making that argument. Continuing to beat the drum on it not only supports our legislator, who has stood up in a very big way in sponsoring the bill, but also prepares us for when that political opportunity becomes available. And I don't think it's this session. I think that's an accurate assessment.
Okay, thank you. And then the last half of that sentence says, and providing the sales tax equalization distribution. Do you anticipate, are there other cities that are also, I would assume there are, but are they also pushing that on their legislative agenda?
So this is something that we're just beginning to have conversations about. So we're doing, reaching out to other cities, and I think looking to Rob to see if he's had any conversations to add to this. But we know that there are other cities that are in a similar financial structure as City of Kenmore in terms of limited retail. So it's a matter of building that coalition. I guess to answer the question, we don't know that there are any other communities that have this on their legislative agenda, but our hope is that there would be greater support for it as Kenmore brings the discussion to the forefront.
So are we, I guess maybe you just answered that then, so are we the only city that's actually bringing this issue up? Or is it dead in the rest of the?
I think there are a lot of communities that are bringing up the fiscal structure of cities and how it is unsustainable. And there are different groupings of communities that have different storylines that go with that unsustainable structure. And there are like communities to Kenmore that are more bedroom communities that are property tax based but not sales tax based. And there's a grouping of those. There's also a grouping of communities that have a different storyline, that are facing fiscal challenges for other reasons. And then there's a grouping of communities that are doing okay. And I think one of the struggles we have in advocating on this issue is that every city is different in identifying that correct structure. So it's not like all cities can come together, go to the legislature, and that same storyline is the same for all 281 cities in the state.
Yeah, and that was kind of my point, because it seemed like this is a net winner and a net loser of an issue. Sometimes things aren't, but this one is clearly, and so it just seems like a really heavy lift if we don't have allies in that battle on that, because you're going to be going up against all these well-funded sales tax cities that they have a vested interest in keeping it the same.
And if I can add to that, so I believe that sales tax, at least among cities, is not distributed equally and fairly. We have a city nearby that collects 6 times as much in sales tax per capita than we do. Our citizens go over there and pay sales tax to that city, and our citizens don't see the benefit. Now, I understand that city needs some additional sales tax to support the businesses and the additional traffic and emergency services and all that, but not 6 times as much. And so I still think there's a fundamental unfairness the way sales tax is distributed. And the state legislature recognized that back in the 1980s, and they did something about it. And it was called sales tax equalization, and they would take state money and send it over to bedroom communities that had that sales tax leakage, where their residents would go to other cities to pay sales tax. And does anybody remember how they funded that flow back to the bedroom communities? It was through car tabs. So motor vehicle excise tax paid for what they call sales tax equalization. In 1999, I-695 happened, where Tim Iman's first debut brought about the passage of that bill, which wiped out sales tax equalization funding by bringing down the car tab fees. At the time, I was working for University Place, which was also a bedroom community, and out of a $10 million budget, we lost $2.7 million in sales tax equalization. It was brutal. Anyway, I think sales tax equalization needs to come back. How it gets funded, I don't have a good proposal for that. But I think we as a bedroom community should recognize that we're not getting our fair share of sales tax.
So I won't say any more on it. So I agree with everything you just said. I just am trying to look at this and try to understand if it's more of a policy statement than that, because these other things, I'm trying to look at a tangible takeaway, and I don't see how that's even possible that we're going to get sales tax equalization. And that's my only comment.
I think one of the distinctions between the legislative agenda and the policy statements is the legislative agenda is really the items that we want our legislators to focus on. So even though there's not a tangible takeaway similar to the Lake Washington Loop Trail or 68th Avenue, like if this is an item that we want our delegation to focus on, then it's something that should be on the legislative agenda as opposed to the policy statements. So I don't know if that gets to your question.
Thank you. That does make sense. And if you get close to running out of space, just go to 0.002 on your margins and you'll be fine.
I think we're at 0.03 right now. So.
Councilmember Marshall.
I've got to say, I am extraordinarily pleased to see the 61st Avenue improvements for the sidewalks over there. That is amazing. I love it. Let's go forth, conquer, get it done. It's sorely needed improvements. Thank you.
All right, so I believe the chair will entertain a motion to accept the legislative agenda.
So moved.
And I'll second. Okay, Council Member Danuski seconded. Any further discussion? Councilmember Shrubnik?
Did we slightly amend it? So do we say as amended, given that we didn't?
I think it's still in draft form, isn't it?
I think, if I can interject, I think,
Please.
I think per Councilmember Shrubnik's idea, adding a sentence about MOTCA funding and brownfield funding.
And I think also under local revenue options for maintenance and preservation in the final sentence where it says that provides new resources and new revenue tools to cities,
Yes.
I believe was a request.
Yeah, I was just looking on your timeline where you said finalize amendments to the state legislative agenda for 2020. That happens in November. That's why I was thinking this was still draft, but
Up
fine.
to you guys.
No, it's fine. Yeah, so then the motion should be to adopt the legislative agenda as amended. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The legislative agenda for 2020 stands approved unanimously. All right. Thank you.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
Drive carefully home.
We will. Shelley will.
Yeah, Shelley's got a much further way to go. All right. North Urban Human Services Alliance, Ms. Gregory, and our clerk, Ms. Shellen.
Hello, good evening. At the City Council retreat held in January, you directed us to set up a meeting to learn more about NUSA, not NUSHA, but NUSA, I'm saying that right, North Urban Human Services Alliance, and report back to you, which is why we're here tonight. Mayor Baker and I met with NUSA representatives here at City Hall in August. The agenda bill and the attachments are in front of you and provide a good overview of NUSA's services.
So as you know, the city's been a member of the North and East Side Funders Pooled Program for many years, and that allocates funds to programs that benefit the Kenmore community. And in fact, our budget for 2019 already allocates over $172,000 for human services contracts, some administered by the funders group and some that the city has awarded directly. Because Kenmore doesn't have a dedicated human services staff position, it's difficult to participate in all the worthy organizations and opportunities that are extended to us, which is why the funders group program is so advantageous to us and makes good use of our limited resources. But Mr. Rob Beam
patiently
is here from NUSA.
Yep, and he's here tonight to present some information to you about the Alliance and answer any questions you may have about the organization. So at this time, I'll invite him up to the podium or the table.
Good evening. Thank you, Councilmember, Mayor. Delighted to be here. Nice to be back at Kenmore City Hall. We've had a number of NUSA meetings in your room back there. I don't know what you call it, the Council Chambers Annex or the meeting room. So thank you for making that space available to us. I serve as a treasurer of NUSA. I formerly was an employee of the city of Shoreline for a number of years, involved with human services issues in North King County. I'm really glad we have the chance to talk a little bit tonight about what this organization does. Our overall long-term goal is to strengthen the capacity of communities in North King County to address their human services needs. And we really do recognize that cities in North King County are not replete with multiple staff for every task that comes your way. I understand that and really appreciate Ms. Chellen's participation with the North and East Funders Group as she can, and interest in these issues, but understand that staff has limitations. Back when Kenmore formed, and I was working in Shoreline, it was known as really a contract city and getting a lot done through contracting, and that model has worked well for you. I think NUSA offers a little bit of that kind of opportunity for you in understanding and advocating for human services needs in North King County. What we do really three things. We bring people together, which is helpful in knowing what's going on. We identify and try and promote solutions to issues that reflect our community's concerns. And we advocate for increased support for human services. Within those things, there's a long list of activities that was included in your agenda materials from 2018. One thing I would want to clarify, in the staff report, you talked about us, NUSA, not coming forward during a competitive process. And we don't compete with funding for our member organizations, which is why we've not participated in those for any of the cities that we work with. I think for understandable reasons, we don't want to be competing with the Eastside Baby Corner that's providing diapers and formula. We are an advocacy organization. We don't sort of touch the noses of individual citizens, other than when our citizens come forward to do work with us. Let me talk a little bit about some of the things we've done more recently. We identified this year that, as you spent a long time with folks from the county, that responding to the needs of our communities, the needs of homeless people, is the wicked issue of our time. We're all working hard on it. Convened meetings, this is the meeting that was in your conference room, put on a little seminar for, three-part seminar for residents on how you interact with people you find living homeless. If you're a business owner, if you're somebody that wants to be helpful, if you're somebody that's concerned about somebody homeless in your community, this was a real hands-on how-to three-part series. Had a number of Kenmore residents involved in the series we did here. We also replicated that series in Shoreline. We've been working now to open a severe weather shelter, which we're hopeful is going to be a location in Shoreline. Still working with the host congregation on some of those details, reflecting on the experience we had last winter when it got so snowy and so cold for so long. And we really had no sort of surge capacity in our shelters in North King County. And that was identified in a lot of the after-action reports of what was going on. So we're working to bring volunteers and faith communities together, people with knowledge of how to provide those services so we can have that up and running. We had hoped to have it up and running by November 1st. I don't think we're going to make that date, but sometime in November, early December. Something we communicate to all our first responders. Again, having a place to meet, we're already a partner with Kenmore, having a place to meet to bring the 25 people interested in that topic together in your city hall was very helpful. It does help to be outside of Shoreline. There's a lot of energy on the west edge of North King County for this, and it's really important that we represent all the communities from Shoreline to Woodinville. It was interesting to be here when the county was presenting. I remember a partnership we had with King County when Mr. Floor had not assumed his current position, but was talking about the Vets and Human Services levy. There are millions of dollars every year allocated to provide services to people across the county. Part of our advocacy work is being sure that the issues and needs of people in North King County are represented, both the agencies, the organizations that provide those services, and the people in need of services, so we can do that convening and do that advocacy. My last point is that one of the real challenging things in providing services in North King County is just knowing what's going on. It's kind of we've got about 10% of the county's population. I don't know what our land mass area, it's not that large, but it's really multiple communities that are operating as one area. You're served by two different HopeLink offices, one in Shoreline and one in Kirkland. You have transportation systems that go across there, two domestic violence agencies that are serving you. I did notice that October's Domestic Violence Awareness Month. Thank you for having your materials out in the front lobby. And just simply knowing what's going on and who are the players is a key thing that service providers need. Or somebody who comes into the community and says, I'd like to do something. Where do I go to meet the people that are doing this work? And the Human Service Alliance provides that kind of a forum. We meet monthly as a regular meeting, and we convene special opportunity kind of meetings. So it does give somebody who wants to learn what's going on, learn who the actors are, a place to go. I think it can be, I'm going to advocate for your membership in the Human Service Alliance, even if you're not able to have staff come and be a part of everything. We do work, we do represent, we're always working, we're representing people across North King County. So as issues would be very particular to the city of Kenmore, and you can pick which ones you want to pay that kind of attention to or that come to your attention, having an organization like the Human Service Alliance ensures that when you have the staff time to dedicate to something, when there is a question that comes forward, you have that resource, and you don't need to go do all that research yourself to start something up. So I think that's an opportunity that having that kind of infrastructure in place brings to you. So I can answer any questions you would have about how we've served Kenmore specifically, the kinds of things we see helping your community, more generic things about how we operate, what kinds of ways Kenmore and Nusha might be able to partner together. Thank you.
Any questions? Councilmember Shrubnik.
I have a few. I want to get, I'm sorry, just a little clearer
Okay.
on your relationship to organizations that are providers of these services. I mean, one statement that you made was that you're putting up working on a low barrier providing a low barrier shelter. Or is it that you're bringing the partners together and they're providing it? And so sort of a part B to that question is the relationship of NUSA to King County, for example, King County Community and Human Services.
Okay. Well, the shelter is a new venture for us. We don't see ourselves as a provider.
Yeah.
So we're bringing, in this instance, faith communities and some community volunteers together. And we don't see this as a long-term thing that we would be doing. There are others providing winter shelter in North King County that we would look to partner with to make that happen. Our relationship to King County, and also, so HopeLink is a member of Human Service Alliance, and New Beginnings is a member of the Alliance. So organizations are members, and we did a survey of those folks a couple of years ago, and the overwhelming piece was we really think it's important to have a voice for human services in North King County, even if we can't come every month. With our relationship with King County, they know that we can convene people in this county, so the county's pretty committed to doing consultations and working with local communities. So when those needs arise, they call us. Mr. Floor's staff calls us. Councilmember Dembowski comes out and meets with us. His staff talks to us. When there's an appointment to one of their boards or committees, we get asked for recommendations. So and we're not shy about talking to the council member's office saying, we think the Vets and Human Services levy needs to really be sure that it's meeting the needs of people in North King County, to the point that sometimes he's not altogether comfortable with what we say. Deputy Mayor?
I want to thank you for coming and presenting. As I've told council before, I've taken part in some of the workshops that you guys have done. I found I wasn't able to make it all three of the series you did around homelessness, but I found the one or two I was able to make it to were really educational and moving. And the work that they've been doing around the winter shelter, convening folks together to find solutions, from government, from nonprofits, from different places. That sort of convening is important, just to get folks talking together. I think when we met last year, you were talking about how part of what NUSA does is when, like when the Vets and Human Service Levy is being put together. You just touched on it, but I was going to bring it up. But ensuring that all of the funds aren't just being spent in South King County and Seattle, and that North King County is getting some of the love out of that, and that we're able to serve our residents up here with some of that county fund. And I think that that's important because that's something that may not, that's something that as a city, we may, that may go right by us when that levy renewal comes, but having a group like you that's kind of keeping an eye on that is helpful for us. And then I was reading through, you guys have, so there's 4 cities that are kind of in your area. Who all, as far as governmental entities, who all has joined?
So the cities of Shoreline and Lake Forest Park at this point have joined.
Okay.
I guess that's what I always think of when I think of North King County is Lake Forest Park and Shoreline, because we're considered East King County, always have been, along with Bothell, along with Woodinville. We're considered East King County. So I guess we belong to this East Side Funders Pool, Northeast Side Funders Pool, and we've had a requirement for years that people that we donate money to or organizations have to provide a distinct service to Kenmore residents, that we require service to Kenmore residents. Yet you don't deal with those programs and deal with the residents. So I'm a little confused as to what service you'll provide that's different from the funders group we belong to and the human service agencies that we're already funding.
So I think in terms of what the Northeast funders do, I'll let you speak to that. I'm was part of that for over 20 years, so I helped found it. But that really is about allocating the
Right.
funds and administering the funds that cities provide.
Right, I guess I'm trying to understand what we would get for the $1,000 versus contributing at somebody whose funding we're not contributing the amount that they've requested. We've reduced it because of other constraints. So I'm just trying to figure out what it is you'll provide to our residents that we're not already getting out of the funders group we belong to.
Well, I think the funders group is not a convening organization. They deal with the contracts that the cities currently have. And I'll go back to consultations on the formation of the Vets and Human Services Levy. The staff in the county called the Alliance to set up those convenings and to bring people into the room to have those discussions. And that's, I mean, they could have called your staff and had them working on that too. We certainly reach out to cities, but that wouldn't be something that I would think the Northeast Funders Group would be doing as a group.
And I guess one of the other concerns is in the staff report we have here is that we really don't have any staff to contribute to this group because of their workload now. So again, I'm a little
I guess
confused what we're going to do.
Well, I think Kenmore has actually been a very supportive partner for some of the Alliance's work already, though it's not with a membership. And I think just in providing space to organize any community activity, having a space to meet is very important. And this is not only an available space, it's a very nice space to meet in. Thank you. And your staff is always excited to see people and talk with us. So learn those issues that we're dealing with. I don't think there's anything magic about the $1,000. I think we have about a $20,000 a year budget for the organization, so that's a significant help in making it go. We have a 20-hour-a-week staff person that helps the organization run. Otherwise, it's a working board that does it. I guess I think that we are different than an agency that provides a direct service to individuals. I think our sense is our constituency is that network of service providers. So to the extent that the county needs to be aware of the way services are delivered in North King County, to understand the kinds of issues facing people in our area, and we can advocate for those. That's something that we as an organization, frankly, don't have somebody in our lobby asking for services. We're a little differently able to do.
Any other questions? So I guess we're looking for staff is looking for direction of providing $1,000 a year for membership in this North Urban Human Services Alliance. Councilmember Curtis.
I guess I was going to give a comment, but that's not what you're asking for. Are you asking for comments yet, or you want a motion?
No, go ahead with comments. I'm looking for a motion, but I'll take comments. I'll take comments.
So I think my challenge is that it doesn't feel like there's that direct dollar amount that our citizens, that we can say, aha, what you're doing affects a certain number of dollar value to our citizens. But it feels like you're doing some work that is helping our citizens. So things like helping the VA program, those dollars, both getting it going in the first place, having that input and making sure, tracking to make sure our area is getting its fair share. I'm guessing we're getting at least $1,000 worth of value for our citizens with the programs that you have. But it's a loose kind of implied sort of relationship. It's really hard to track and say, aha, I can put it in my budget and I know exactly where that went. So I'm not saying that's good or bad. I'm just saying that that's my challenge, is that I think there is benefit, at least $1,000 worth, but it's harder to put a number on it and track it.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly don't see any issue with using space in City Hall, you know, like you have in the past, but I have a problem with thousands of Councilmember.
Yeah, thanks for coming out. This was all really good information, and it's a really good organization. I guess I'm not seeing, especially because staff can't support it, I'm not seeing the hole we're trying to fill for $1,000 that we have. Our funders program is doing well. So I think right now, knowing our budget and what we're trying to do with that, I think I probably wouldn't join at this point. But it's good to have all this information and keep that on our things to do.
Deputy Mayor.
I mean, for what it's worth, I think that there is some value in having Shoreline and Lake Forest Park and Kenmore having kind of an advocacy group that understands our issues when it comes to the larger kind of county infrastructure and knows all the players in our area, so that if we do have an issue, we have kind of a central place where we can call and say, hey, you know, who should we talk to about this, you know, about this idea we have? What partners could we potentially talk to? And Nusha is kind of in the best place to kind of help us on that front. You know, frankly, I think we have more in common with Lake Forest Park and Shoreline than we do, you know, Kirkland or Bellevue when it comes to a lot of these things, just from a geographic standpoint and from a service provider standpoint. But if the will's not there, the will's not there. But I think there's some value out of this.
Councilmember Shrubnik.
Yeah, I would concur with Councilmember Herbig in terms of potential value. I'm willing to go down that road. I know, for example, on the Census Count Committee, we were trying to identify a human service provider or two to partner for the Regional Census Fund grants. And we were grasping at straws. I mean, the flip side of that is we kind of all said, well, why don't we contact NUSA? And we couldn't figure out that they're there to do that. So, and I wonder would membership help with that? Would we, I mean, we weren't able to connect to figure that piece out.
So I know we did participate in one of your complete count committee.
Yeah, the most recent, yeah.
I think the whole conversation we're having is part of making that connection. I would think that next time a question like that came up, you could call us and we'd answer the phone.
Right, and a corollary question. I mean, we're starting to talk about things like the utility district having the reduced. What's a reduced fee? The name of the program is escaping me.
Utility tax discount for low income.
Utility tax discount, and having them actually come to the city a couple times a month potentially to offer that, potentially having that paired with other human services so that we start to have a somewhat of a local human service presence. I mean, that hasn't been an area that we have, gotten into much, and there's a reason for that. But, if we can leverage existing organizations so that we're not spending our own dollars to do that, and yet we're bringing resources to our residents locally, if that's something, I would think that would be tremendously valuable if, NUSA were, potentially interested in helping us work on something like that. I don't know if that's in your bailiwick.
Was Nusha involved in that?
No.
No, not specifically. But I think the way I'd answer your question and Councilmember Curtis's question is that about benefit to folks in Kenmore it's one thing to have a utility tax rebate program. It's another thing to help people really understand
Right.
that it's there.
Right.
And I think that's the place that the Alliance can be valuable, is working with other human service providers who will come into contact with
Right.
people, having this kind of an advocacy voice in the community helps to get those kinds of messages out. And that's the part that's difficult for people to, as staff turns over in agencies, as organizations change, as new programs come online, you just develop that community of people that have that kind of information flow.
Yeah, I'm just a little concerned, like with the baby care, the diaper, that asks for funding, that we can't give them the entire amount. That I can look, that this could help fund some of these programs that provide a definite service to our people. So that's one of my concerns, is that is one example of a proven organization that delivers directly to our residents.
Right, they're kind of apples and oranges, right?
Right.
I mean, this is an advocacy, information awareness organization, brings people together. It is, and that was why I asked my first question. It is not a direct service provider, nor does it compete with them for funds.
Yeah, and these are human service dollars, and that's what I was concerned with.
Well, we can always bump up our human service dollars by $1,000 during budget if we want to. I mean,
We
we're not locked in.
So anyway, I guess the question before us then is to provide direction to NUSA for membership. Is there a motion?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and make the motion that we join as a city, the North Urban Human Services Alliance.
Yeah, remember, staff doesn't have time, right?
I'll second that.
Correct.
Great,
Yes,
okay.
I understand.
Moved and seconded, okay. Well, since the clerk's sitting there, it'd be difficult for her to call the roll.
I can.
Okay, go for it.
I don't have my
If
cheat.
there's- Are there any further questions?
Your random distribution, no, we messed up. but-
She is versatile.
If there are no further questions, will the clerk please call the roll?
I don't have my cheat sheet, but I'll start. Councilmember Smith?
Yes.
Councilmember Marshall?
Yes.
Councilmember Curtis?
Yes.
Councilmember Shrubnik?
Yes.
Mayor Baker?
No.
Deputy Mayor Herbig?
Yes.
Councilmember Danuski?
No.
So, pass.
Motion passes. Next item on the agenda, approval amendment number 2 to contract number 18-C 1946 with Skipstone Consulting.
Good evening, Council. I understand that there are some questions. When this item was on the consent agenda at the most recent council meeting. And I'll just say that we have been working with this firm for nearly a year. And the scope of the contract is really to help implement one of the key recommendations from the Economic Development Strategy Update that the council adopted in 2018. And that is to find ways to encourage and stimulate office development, other commercial development in Kenmore. And the work is going well. We'd like to extend the term of the contract and allow for some extra work, which is already well underway, but specifically working with our staff around what are some possible incentives to propose for office development, because we're not known as a big office community, but we know that there's demand for it, and so that work would continue, and we would anticipate not only working with staff, but having the consultant be available to brief the council and planning commission as needed. And then we would also like to have the consultant be working with one of our consultants on pro forma work for Lake Point, looking at some different kinds of development scenarios and how that might pencil. AP Hurd, who is the primary consultant in this firm, was previously president of Touchstone Development, a big development entity in Seattle that did a lot of the office development around the Fremont area that just wasn't there before, but is really now a center for tech offices. So it's good work that we're doing with the firm. We'd like to continue it. So happy to answer any questions.
Curtis?
So I was one of the people who had questions on this, and I think partly it's, so even though we've been working with them for a year, it doesn't feel like we've gotten reports, or else I forgot they've occurred. But just, if we're spending money on something, just keeping us updated, what are their findings, even though I know there might be some eventual report, but maybe an interim kind of update? How, what are we getting for our money? And
absolutely,
then,
yep.
So that's kind of one thing, and then it confused me, the Lake Point issue, because I think we have somebody else that we've given a certain pot of funds to look at the quotes, less is more, and it feels like we have now two people working on Lake Point, and that felt confusing to me. So I think those were my two questions.
Yeah, Ms. Hurd brings a different perspective, as far as, well, what are the, Mr. O'Connor, who's doing the pro forma, is doing the numbers, but with her experience, Ms. Hurd is someone who could say, well, what if it was a less is more type of development scenario? What might that look like? What's worked in different parts, not only of this country, but other countries as well, because she has a hand in a lot of international discussions and development too. So we did have a really productive conversation with senior staff around, so what are some incentives that might be worth looking into? And so that work, we want to continue that, which would be with the Planning Commission and ultimately, certainly with the council. But I'm sure that, at any point of this project, if the council wanted to have an update, that would be like totally doable, and I think would be really beneficial.
Any other questions? So this was on our consent agenda last week. So we're looking for a motion to approve amendment number 2 to contract C18-C1946 with Skipstone Consulting. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any further discussion? All of those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That motion passes unanimously. Staff report.
Thank you.
Yeah, just a few things. We recently got a request, Nancy Owsley got a request from Representative Del Bene's office to have a town hall meeting on November 9th, Saturday, November 9th, here at City Hall at 10 a.m. in the morning, and so that's looking good. We found that City Hall is available that day, so we're excited to have Congresswoman Del Bene come for a town hall meeting. Grateful that she's handpicked our City Hall as the place to do it. Also, December 7th, it's also a Saturday, is shaping up to be a busy day. Looks like we'll have our legislative send-off for our 46th District Legislative Delegation that day at 10 a.m. at Bastyr University. And then later that day is the tree lighting event. So mark your calendars for that. Lastly, next Monday, is a special meeting, 5:30 joint meeting with the city councils of Lake Forest Park and Shoreline at Shoreline City Hall. And then because of the timing and everything, it's looking like we'll come back here for an executive session at 7:15. So because of the 5:30 and the 7:15, we're calling it a special meeting. And normally it's a regular meeting night, but because of the odd start times, what we're planning to do, if there's a consensus of the council and no objections, we'll cancel our regular meeting for the 28th and then have the special meeting at 5:30 and 7:15. So.
All right. Comments, reports, initiatives. Councilmember Smith.
I attended the Missing Middle Forum this last week, and staff did a great job of pulling together a really good group of developers, professors, architects, everything. And it was actually, I mean, a lot of the stuff is stuff we already knew, but it was really nice when you hear things that reinforces sort of the track we're on and everything. So I appreciated the work that went into that, and it was great to have them out here. And it was a good turnout. That's all.
Councilmember Marshall.
So whoever had a hand in getting that 61st sidewalk improvement into the legislative agenda, I've got to thank you from the bottom of my heart. That's amazing work. Thank the whole council, I guess. It's all of our incentive too, plus staff, so just great work.
Those sidewalks on 61st Avenue, they keep me up at night. So.
Councilmember Curtis.
I'd also like to just comment on the presentation we had on the middle housing affordability. It was an impressive panel. This, for a small city, to put together a panel of that substance, I mean, that could have been in front of Seattle and absolutely carried the weight. So I hope lots of people watch it since it was recorded. So I have lots of ideas that I'm sure we'll discuss at our January retreat.
Councilmember Shrevenick.
I concur. I went and was equally impressed, and I think the fact that we had a county councilwoman come and is testament to the level of the panelists. It was terrific. And yes, we will hopefully be bringing a number of ideas to the retreat. Before the retreat, I did have one thought, and I don't know if it was last week or the week before, I talked a little bit about kind of climate change priorities and things we could do locally. I mean, climate change is made up of two things, right? Reducing emissions and increasing carbon uptake. And so I'm wondering whether, as a first foray into this, we could bring back the tree canopy study and the recommendations and start to look at, what can we do locally. There were some good recommendations in there and some existing programs in our region that we could adopt fairly easily. So I'm hoping that we can do that. I don't know whether I need to wait to the retreat to do that, but I would love to see that report come back and have some more discussion about that.
Councilmember Danuski.
Nothing to add.
Deputy Mayor.
Kind of building off what Councilmember Shernick was saying, there actually is an opportunity where we could, if we wanted to, plug in. There's the Puget Sound Clean Air Agency is right now taking comments on possibly doing what's the word I'm looking for? Sorry, my brain just froze completely. A clean fuel standard, a low carbon fuel standard, sorry, for the Puget Sound Clean Air region. And they're currently taking comments. I think if we wanted to interface in a way around addressing carbon, the two big ones are cars and buildings. This is a place where we could weigh in if we wanted to. Those worth taking a look at. But I also thought that the panel that staff got together was really amazing. I learned some stuff there, and I thought it was a great conversation starter. I hope that we continue that in January.
Back to this that we discussed the first thing tonight. So, I need direction from council whether to support Sound Cities and the underlined principles here, and obviously getting the rest of the questions answered, or to not support Sound Cities.
Well, that framing is a little.
Well, but that's what it is.
No.
Either I vote
Okay,
yes
because
with Sound Cities, or I vote no.
well, no, because Sound Cities hasn't taken an official position
They're
yet. So
taking a position, they're taking.
yes, they're
an
asking you to
official
take it, but they have not yet. So you're not.
And that's what I need to know. how
Right,
to
so,
vote.
right, but I'm saying the way that you framed it, you were either voting with Sound Cities or against Sound, that's until they have a position, which they do not, and they won't until this is voted on, they don't have a position to vote against.
Right, and so this.
Okay, I
this
just
is our
wanted to,
next meeting.
right, I just wanted to clarify that
Okay.
the way you framed it was not exactly 100% correct, because Sound Cities does not have a position. This is not their official position, it's a proposed position.
Right.
And voting against this is not voting against Sound Cities or voting against it in their city.
Voting against this position.
It's voting against this position, which is not Sound City's position. I just want to be clear on that, because the way you just framed that is voting against this is voting against Sound Cities. This is not Sound City's official position yet. I just want to be clear on this,
Okay.
because Sound Cities officially does not have a position on
We're
this.
already in a preliminary vote on this, and so. either
Well,
way-
okay, but there isn't a position yet, and the way you framed it was very like, I'm either with them or against them, and all that said, I don't really have a problem with it, but the framing seemed a little
So we're
off.
back to the thing. Do we support this proposed position or not?
Sounds like it's pretty much just asking for more information,
Yeah.
and I support that.
Yeah, I think it's
So-
great to get questions answered.
Yeah.
I don't
And
necessarily
these underlined are the
support,
guiding principles that Sound Cities is proposing.
I don't necessarily agree with
to work
them,
under.
but yeah, I agree with getting the questions answered. I wouldn't. More information. Yeah, I'm not willing to sign on to these principles.
So you're
but
not willing to sign on to
I'm
these?
not, but,
Okay.
yeah. But, I think getting the question, I mean, they posed a bunch of questions. I don't know, the principles
They
don't
do,
necessarily fit with
But
those.
these are the underlying principles that we're voting on.
But they're not. I mean, SCA members have significant questions about the value of forming a new government PDA. That's not a principle. It's not a statement of principle.
Okay.
So this is,
So the first
it doesn't make any
paragraph up in
sense.
top in bold, bring back the following principles for
Right, and those
possible
are
action.
principles. Yeah.
And those underlying things are the possible positions, the principles that we will be acting on. Below those are still questions that we have, but the underlined things are the principles that we're voting on. I just want to be clear.
For a vote?
I'm looking for direction.
this gets to what my question was when we were discussing it, because it just wasn't clear to me what the vote, what it was you wanted. I think I get what it is, and I generally support getting all this information answered, so if that's what you're asking.
We're going to get the information answered, but we are voting to support those principles.
Okay, so when they have answers to these, quote, principles, at that point, we no longer support this document, right? Because we'll now have answers that
Well, you
we
see,
don't know
that's-
what they would be. I get-
My
that's-
understanding
That's what I'm
is,
trying,
when we vote, we are voting to support these principles. These are some questions that we need answered, but these are the underlying principles
Okay.
that we are voting to support.
so these 6 principles,
Right. So, for instance, the sub-regional planning is key to the success of a region-wide effort, right? And cities have been told that funds will be distributed without regard whether jurisdictions agree to sign on the ILA or service agreement. And we're saying this really needs to be formalized. So, the policy or the position is, or the principle is to support sub-regional planning. And recognizing it's the key to success in a region-wide effort.
Is it go
Yeah,
ahead, Deb.
no, go ahead, yeah.
Is it unreasonable for it to be spelled out that if this body that they're forming is going to have tax authority or revenue generating authority, that would be a principle that would be outlined in here?
Doesn't have that, though.
Pardon?
But they're not going to. They're pretty clear with that. They're not going to have revenue generating authority.
Yeah, but when Rod was talking about it, he said in a PDA that there's language in a PDA that does give you authority to ask directly
To
for
request. So what he was saying is they would have authority to go to like King County and say, hey, King County, can you pass a levy for us? Which is different than.
Okay.
Which is different than the PDA putting something on the ballot. They'd still have to go through either Seattle or King County or some other thing, but they can't put anything on the ballot themselves.
Right.
So then, no, if that, first of all, our city attorney looked like she wanted to say something.
I concurred. I thought that's what I heard them say, and that to change that, they'd have to come back.
Have to have some sort of state.
Correct. They'd have to go back to the state to get the authority, but they don't have it now.
Okay.
And the other principle that we're supporting is that any board or committee of elected officials should have equitable distribution of power between King County, Seattle, and SCA.
And I guess my comment on that is, what do you mean by equitable? I mean, we're not contributing anything from Sound Cities. So, the money's coming from Seattle and King County. So I'm delighted that they are open to having 2 seats for Sound Cities. I think that's great. I think we need to recognize where we're at. Without a definition of what that means, I wouldn't support it.
Well, my understanding of what that is there's 2 seats for each entity. 2 for Seattle, 2 for King County, 2 for South Cities.
And that's what they're proposing, right.
That's what it says on this paper.
Yeah.
So, we can get the questions answered.
Yes.
So, looking at the other side of the page, so I'm asking myself these 6 underlined things.
Mhm.
Could I support them, yes or no? And then I think honestly, number 6 is so confusing with all the questions, I'm not sure it's really a principle. But starting with number 1, before an entity would be formed, there needs to be high-level agreement among policymakers across the region on what objectives we have for an entity. I don't see that realistically happening. So regional policymakers, there's no format for us to all get together and come to an agreement on what our objectives will be. So I think we can have input, but I just don't see that being realistic.
Well, go ahead.
So let's say there's 3 goals, including maybe we're going to see less people, less homeless.
Right.
So I don't see how we're going to get a regional-wide group to agree on what 3 or 4 principles this entity will have. So I just don't, maybe it would be nice, but I just don't see it as happening. Number 2, if a new governance structure is established, policymakers, elected officials, should set policy. So that's very different than the proposal we were given. The proposal we were given gives some elected input, but they are not the ones actually setting all the policies. So basically, as I go through each of these, there are major differences between this and this.
Right.
And so the question is, do we basically reject this, is what it feels like this is saying.
Yes. The way that is today, yes.
I guess I'm not sure these questions are so vague. It's sort of like reading a Rorschach. I'm looking at the steering committee. They confirm or reject the 5-year plan. That, to me, is setting policy. And they do the same for the budget, which to me is setting the budget. The budgets come from the people putting the money in, right? And they're going to make the recommendations through the governing board. It's how I'm reading this is that the steering committee is vetting those, is confirming or rejecting those. So maybe I just didn't get it.
Yeah, Deputy Mayor.
I have my kind of major concern in this is the final bullet point, approval of any major decision should have approval from at least one representative from each of the three SCA, Seattle, King County, ensure there's regional buy-in. I mean, I like the idea of SCA having a couple seats to the board. I think that makes a lot of sense. I think the idea that if any one of these groups locks up, they should be able to put the kibosh on any of the, the idea that 1/3 of the group could lock up and essentially have a veto because Seattle's unhappy with something, or because the two King County council members, or the exec and the council member are unhappy, or the two SCA members are happy, and they should be able to veto something. Just seems wildly undemocratic to me. I'm not a huge fan of this final bullet point myself.
That goes back to the underlying policy there, or the underlying principle, that any board or committee of elected officials should have equitable distribution of power.
Well, right, there's equitable distribution of power, which is, we have 2 votes, they have 2 votes, King County has 2 votes, and then there's 2 other folks who have lived experiences. But then the idea that the SCA cities, or, Seattle, frankly, I think is where you're more likely to see something. Seattle locks up and decides we're not gonna do it, and then you essentially have a veto by a quarter, essentially, of the governing board. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me.
But doesn't that have to do with the simple majority of vote?
Well, no, it doesn't, because it says approval of any major decision should have approval from at least one representative from each of the 3 areas. So that means that both of the Seattle folks say no, then you've essentially
Oh, I see what you're saying, yeah.
vetoed the legislation with 1/4 of the governing body,
I see what you're saying.
or the steering committee, sorry, not liking it. I think that is, I don't think that's a great governance structure myself.
But on that point, if you look at the alternative, so let's say that does happen. Let's say you're not getting either 2 of the SCA votes, or you're not getting 2 of the county votes, or you don't have 2 of the, in any of those scenarios, then I would argue you have bad policy, because if you're not getting at least one of them to buy in, then something's really wrong here.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I think another important thing that he mentioned, that the homeless count was almost as big down in South King
Yeah.
County as in Seattle.
Right.
So it feels like the people with an almost equal number of issues should have some vote, even though it's just Seattle's putting in the big bucks, but the other areas still have the big problems.
Right. And that's why the thing is, it's a regional problem, and each one of the subregions have their own unique sets of problems that have to be addressed.
And they must be putting some money in. If they've got as many homeless as Seattle almost, they must be spending some money that we're not seeing in this pot.
There is indirectly some money from the different pots of money that the county has that's being put into this. So indirectly, there is money going in.
And some cities contribute to organizations like Arch, and, there's lots of pots of money, but, yeah.
That's why this is going to be so hard to figure out.
Yeah, it seems like there's enough concerns we're all supportive of the idea of getting the questions answered, but it seems like there's enough vagaries of this that, it's sort of like not a, we support this or we don't. There's just, it doesn't work.
Well,
Doesn't work. It's not defined
That's
in
what
a way
they're
we can
asking
do
for,
that.
is support of these following principles, those 6. So if there's not agreement on supporting those 6, then we shouldn't support those 6. It's simple.
So you're going back and asking, or representing us on?
Yes.
So then if that's the case, you probably want feedback as to why we wouldn't support them, and you should probably have the appropriate feedback.
Fine.
I
have
I'm not
some
saying I
already.
even know what that, I just know that if I went back
Right.
as the representative, I'd want to say why.
Right, and so one of the things that I'm getting, that why you're not supporting, the group is not supporting this, is because two votes out of Seattle or 2 votes out of King County can kill the whole issue. Your point is, well, if that happens to policy, then it must be bad, because that shouldn't happen. But that's one of the things that I'm getting that we're not really pleased with. I'm sure there's others.
I also think possibly proposal might be more efficient. Big question is sort of is going to replace the King County.
Right. And so one of the concerns a number of the cities have is it's just another government agency. Why do we need another government agency?
I don't feel it.
Because it hasn't worked yet.
Pardon?
I mean,
So,
you know, you heard it.
let's throw more money at it.
It's, well, it's a completely different government structure, so it would, anyway.
It is hard to imagine creating a whole new bureaucratic level of governance without having some negative impact on the funding stream somehow. That's the part that it just doesn't even seem natural. It's like it defies logic. And so that's the part that is, I think it's hard to kind of grasp how that's going to function in a rational manner without having.
I mean, that's one of the things I find frustrating is they want to create this new agency, but they don't have any goals for it.
Well,
What's the goal?
The goals were alignment and equity, right? I mean, it's in the
So
presentation.
there's really no goal of trying to end homelessness.
I think that's the idea, presumably, is the downstream impact of that.
Where's a measurable outcome from
yeah.
forming
If
this?
that's not one of their major three things, then something's wrong.
Yeah,
Well,
I know.
it's not in here.
surprising, yeah.
You know, on that,
To be a question on this either.
No, it's not.
It seems very black and white.
So do we have any consensus about